Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity gets cozy and the world's biggest questions are allowed to unfold at a gentler pace. Tonight, we're drifting toward one of the most famous rivers on Earth, a river so well known that many of us feel as if we already understand it before we have even seen it. The Nile, a name that arrives with so much baggage packed into it. Maps, pyramids, pharaohs, crocodiles, school books, travel posters, documentaries with very serious narrators, and perhaps one or two scenes of someone in a sun hat gazing heroically at the water as if they personally discovered it 5 minutes ago. And yet, for all its fame, the Nile has a strange habit of staying just out of reach. Not invisible, of course. You can stand beside it, you can sail on parts of it, you can photograph it, study it, trace it, dam it, argue over it, romanticize it, and write very dramatic things about it in hardback editions with gold lettering. But truly explore it, fully, completely, in the way we like to imagine explorers once did with a map, a boat, and a deeply questionable level of confidence. That turns out to be another matter entirely. Before we settle into that question, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. What part of the world are you in right now? And what does water mean where you are? Is it something close by, a river, a coast, a lake, a canal? Or are you listening from somewhere dry, somewhere far from any current at all, where a great river feels almost like a rumour? There's something nice about that, I think. All of us in different places, each with our own weather, our own hour, our own small sounds in the room, gathering for a while beside a river that has drawn people toward it for thousands upon thousands of years. If this kind of slow journey is your sort of thing, if you enjoy these quiet wanderings through history, geography, and all the odd corners where human certainty begins to wobble, I'd be very grateful if you liked the video, maybe subscribed, and stayed with this little corner of calm. It helps Life Beyond Seen find others who might want a softer kind of story before sleep, or before a long night, or before one more cup of tea that probably did not need to happen, and yet here we are. Now get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop a little. There is no rush tonight. We're not trying to conquer a river, which is fortunate, because rivers tend to be unimpressed by that sort of ambition. We're only trying to understand why the Nile, of all rivers, still resists the neat little human dream of being fully known. It is easy, at first glance, to assume that famous things are settled things. We know the Nile, don't we? It runs through Africa. It gave life to ancient Egypt. It flows north, which many people find slightly suspicious, as if rivers ought to have a better sense of direction. It has tributaries, it has cataracts, it has swamps, it has history in layers so thick that almost every stretch of bank seems to contain a story, a ruin, a memory, a border dispute, a prayer, a tax, a flood, a harvest, or a boat that probably should not have been trusted in that weather. That is the simple version, the one that sits nicely in the mind. But the Nile in real life is not a single clean ribbon drawn across a classroom wall. It is not one story. It is not one path. It is not one beginning and one end in the tidy way people prefer. It is a system, a very large one, a stubborn one, a river connected to lakes, highlands, marshes, deserts, seasonal rains, old empires, modern states, engineering schemes, transport problems, disease, sediment, politics, and the enduring human tendency to look at a complicated thing and say, surely this can be simplified. The Nile, regrettably for our sense of order, does not like being simplified. Even the idea of exploring the Nile contains a quiet little problem. What do we mean by explore? To travel along it, to map it, to know its source, to know all its sources if there are several ways of defining that, to understand the people who live by it, to control it, to see every stretch of it with your own eyes, to understand its changing behaviour over time, to know what it was before dams altered it, before borders fenced it, before satellite imagery made us think a place had become comprehensible simply because we could see its outline from above. The word itself carries an old mood with it. Explore. It sounds adventurous and noble, at least until you look more closely and realise it often meant arriving late to a place where other people already lived, naming what already had names, and behaving with remarkable self-importance while writing it all down. Rivers have endured a lot of that. The Nile more than most. For centuries, the Nile sat at the centre of one of the most admired civilizations on Earth, and yet the river beyond Egypt remained hazy in the minds of outsiders. Its lower course was deeply familiar to those who lived by it. Its annual flood-shaped calendars, farming, religion, administration, and survival. But farther south, the river moved through zones that were harder for northern powers, and later for European powers, to penetrate, describe, and neatly package. Distance was part of the problem. Terrain was part of the problem. Climate was part of the problem. The cheerful refusal of reality to behave like a drawing room fantasy was also part of the problem. People love to imagine a river as a guide. Follow the water, and eventually it will explain itself. In storybooks, perhaps. In practice, rivers can branch, vanish into wetlands, become impassable, run through territory that does not welcome your arrival, or depend on seasonal patterns that make 1 month almost manageable, and the next a complete nuisance. The Nile manages several of these tricks at once, and that is where its reputation becomes so interesting. The Nile is probably one of the most recognised rivers on the planet, yet the deeper one goes into its full geography, the less it behaves like a famous landmark and the more it behaves like a very large, ancient shifting set of problems wearing the polite disguise of a river. Think of the image many people carry in their heads when they hear the word Nile. A broad blue strip cutting through golden desert. Maybe some reeds, maybe a felucca with a triangular sail. Perhaps a temple nearby, because in the popular imagination Egypt likes to arrive with architectural support. It is not a false image exactly. It is simply incomplete, and incompleteness can be more misleading than outright error. Because when a picture is partly true, we stop asking what has been left outside the frame. Outside that frame there are equatorial lakes, there are uplands fed by heavy rains, there are swamp regions where water spreads, slows, evaporates, twists and lingers in ways that make straight-line thinking look rather silly. There are rocky sections where navigation becomes dangerous. There are stretches of river that are easy to admire from a distance and deeply inconvenient to move along in reality. There are political frontiers layered over old cultural landscapes. There are local histories far older than many outsiders ever bothered to learn. There are practical risks. There are seasonal changes. There are places where the river is not a line but a maze. That may be one reason the Nile remains so magnetic. It embarrasses certainty. The more famous it becomes, the less complete our understanding of it seems to feel. One generation goes looking for its source. Another tries to measure its flow. Another tries to control it. Another studies its ecology. Another argues over rights to its water. Another looks back and realizes that many earlier descriptions were partial, biased, self-serving, or simply wrong. The river stays. The explanations keep changing. There is also the question of scale, which sounds dull right up until it stops being dull and starts ruining your travel plans. On a map, even a very large river can look manageable. You place a finger on one point and slide it to another, and feel for a brief and delusional second that the thing has been mentally mastered. The map, meanwhile, remains calm and complicit. It does not mention heat. It does not mention insects. It does not mention transport delays, regional conflict, shallow channels, bureaucratic permissions, broken engines, swollen currents, reeds thick as walls, or a section of water that looks passable until the local boatman, who has significantly better judgment than you, says absolutely not. Maps are wonderful inventions, but they flatter us. They make difficulty look decorative. The Nile has been especially good at punishing that kind of optimism. From a distance, it looks like continuity. On the ground, it becomes interruption after interruption. Different climates, different elevations, different communities, different rules, different hazards. different historical layers piled on top of one another, until the question, why can't we truly explore it, starts to sound less like a mystery and more like a very natural consequence of what the river actually is. There is a habit, especially in older storytelling, of treating exploration as a finishable task. Someone goes somewhere unknown, records it, names it, and then the place is entered into the ledger of the known world as if that settles matters forever. Stamp the map, case closed, put the kettle on. But rivers do not stay fixed in the way that old imperial fantasies preferred. They shift, their banks change, their channels alter, their floods rise and fall differently from one era to the next. Human interventions transform them, wetlands expand or shrink, dams reorder timing and sediment, populations grow, states change policy, access changes, meaning changes. So even if you could see every reach of the Nile, and that alone would be no modest feat, you would still be seeing only one version of it, a river at one moment, under one set of conditions, framed by one set of political arrangements and one set of technologies. To know the Nile fully, you would need more than travel. You would need time, a great deal of it. Perhaps several lifetimes and a much sturdier notebook. That may sound almost unfair, and perhaps it is. We like solvable things. We like treasure hunts with a final box to open. We like the satisfying moment when someone in a documentary says, and at last, after years of searching, the mystery was resolved. But the Nile does not resolve. It accumulates. That is one of the reasons it remains alive in the imagination. It cannot be reduced to a single triumph of discovery, because each answer leads to another layer of complication. Take something as simple sounding as a source. People become very excited about sources. The first drop, the true beginning, the exact point where a river starts being itself. It sounds wonderfully precise. Rivers, again, are not always in a cooperative mood. What counts as the real source? The farthest headstream, the largest contributor of water, the most seasonally important feeder, the stream that remains continuous, the lake outlet, the wetland-fed branch that behaves differently depending on rainfall. Very quickly, the romantic image of one dramatic spring bubbling from a sacred rock gives way to the hydrological equivalent of paperwork. And still, people chase it, because humans are deeply attached to beginnings. We want the Nile to have one because that would make it behave like a sentence. Instead, it behaves more like a long conversation interrupted by weather, geology, politics, and time. There is also something almost funny in the way the Nile defeats our modern confidence. We live with satellites now. We have remote sensing, aerial imaging, hydrological models, archives, databases, academic journals, GPS, and enough screens to convince ourselves that every corner of the planet has been neatly itemized. Yet even in such an age, a river system can remain resistant to full human possession. Not unseen, not unstudied, but not exhausted, not finished. That should be comforting, really. There is still room in the world for things that exceed the brochure, and the Nile exceeds it in every direction. It exceeds the ancient stories told about it. It exceeds the colonial fantasies projected onto it. It exceeds the travel version of it sold to tourists. It exceeds the engineering version of it treated as a measurable asset. It exceeds the schoolbook version of it reduced to one civilization, however extraordinary that civilization may have been. It exceeds even the scientific version if by science we mean the hope that data alone makes a living landscape simple. None of this means the Nile is unknowable in some mystical sense. It is not magic. It is not a riddle placed on Earth for dramatic effect. It is a real river system in a real world, and many people know it intimately in ways outsiders do not. Fishermen know parts of it. Farmers know parts of it. Boat pilots know parts of it. Local communities know parts of it. Historians know parts of it. Hydrologists know parts of it. Ecologists know parts of it. Archaeologists know parts of it. Governments know the parts they are most concerned with, usually those involving infrastructure, leverage, or arguments. but no single gaze takes in the whole thing at once. That is the point. Not ignorance. Fragmentation. The Nile is too large, too old, too inhabited, too altered, and too changeable to be wrapped up by one narrative voice standing on a deck in khaki trousers. And perhaps that is why it still draws people in. Because the river resists being finished. Because just when it seems familiar, another layer appears. The famous lower reaches lead toward questions of empire and agriculture. The middle stretches raise questions of transport and historical contact. The farther systems draw us into highland rains, great lakes, marshes, and all the practical obstacles that made certainty so hard to come by. Then modern life adds another layer altogether, with dams, borders, development, conservation, and competing needs laid over older worlds that did not disappear just because someone drew a line on a map. So as we ease into this journey, it helps to set aside one comforting illusion. The illusion that the Nile is one smooth, fully graspable object, waiting to be toured from end to end like a museum corridor. It is not. It is a network, a history, a set of landscapes, and a long argument between water and everything that tries to fix it in place. That is why we cannot truly explore it in the complete, triumphant, final way the word sometimes suggests. Not because no one has gone far enough, not because the river is hiding in some theatrical fog waiting for the right dramatic entrance, but because the Nile is larger than the old idea of exploration itself. To move along it is possible in places. To study it is possible in many ways. To know parts of it deeply is very possible indeed. But to say, now the Nile is fully explored, would be a little like saying, I have finished understanding weather, or I know everything important about the sea. One hesitates to recommend either sentence in public, and once you begin to see the Nile this way, the question changes. It stops being, why has no one solved it yet? And becomes, what sort of river would make that impossible? A river with many beginnings, a river broken by terrain, a river entangled with human history at every turn, a river shaped by landscapes that refuse to stay tidy, a river that gives life while also limiting movement, a river famous enough to seem familiar and complicated enough to punish that assumption every single time, which is exactly where we need to go next, because before anyone can chase a beginning, argue over a source, or imagine tracing the Nile from first drop to final delta, we need to look at the mismatch between the river on a map and the river in real life, and that is where the trouble starts becoming visible. When most of us picture the Nile, we picture certainty, a single river, a clear line, a long blue stroke pulled confidently down a map of Africa, as if someone with a steady hand and excellent self-belief simply decided that this, there, is the Nile, and that settles it. It looks so orderly from above, so obedient, so ready to be understood. You can follow it with a fingertip in a matter of seconds. There it is, beginning somewhere deep inland, gathering itself and then making its long way north until it spreads into a fan of water and farmland before meeting the Mediterranean. Clean, elegant, reassuring. The sort of river that seems to invite explanation. And maps are very good at creating that feeling. They smooth, they flatten, they tidy up the earth until it looks as though everything has agreed to behave. Swamps become pale green patches, cataracts turn into tiny notches. Vast stretches of difficult terrain shrink into the distance between one label and the next. A place that might take weeks to reach becomes a neat little gap between two printed names. The whole business starts to look rather manageable, at least until you attempt the minor detail of existing inside the landscape instead of above it. That is the first trouble with the Nile. The map gives you a promise the real river does not keep, because on a map the Nile appears to be one thing. In real life it is many things at once. It is broad and calm in one place, broken and violent in another. It is bordered by fields in one stretch, by rock in another, by marsh in another, by heat and distance and the sort of silence that makes a person suddenly very respectful of water bottles. It is a river, yes, but also a corridor, a barrier, a lifeline, a political fact, a memory machine, and in many places a practical inconvenience to anyone still under the illusion that straight blue lines are easy to travel. Take the schoolbook image of the Nile in Egypt. That picture is not wrong, exactly. A river moving through arid land, feeding narrow bands of life, then widening into the delta. This image has endured because it is striking, and because it is true enough to be useful. But true enough is not the same as complete. That lower Nile, the one framed by temples, fields, villages, ferries and modern cities, is only one face of the river. It is the Nile many outsiders know best because it is visible, monumental, and historically loud. Ancient Egypt made sure of that. When a civilization leaves behind pyramids, statues, obelisks, tombs, and enough surviving symbolism to fill half the world's museums, it tends to dominate the imagination. So people start to think they know the river because they know that one famous section of it. They know the Nile as backdrop, the Nile as stage lighting, the Nile as the patient blue companion of pharaohs, grain barges, and dramatic documentary music. What tends to disappear from that image is the rest of the river system, and the rest, as rivers so often like to point out, is where things become complicated. From above, the Nile looks singular. On the ground, it behaves like an argument between environments. The White Nile, slow and extended, tied to the Great Lakes and swampy systems farther south. The Blue Nile, descending from the Ethiopian highlands with seasonal force and dramatic importance. Tributaries, branches, floodplains, marshes, seasonal variations, regional differences. It is less a lone ribbon than a conversation between waters that do not all arrive the same way, from the same place, or with the same temperament. Yet a map, for all its usefulness, is not in the business of temperament. It deals in shape, not behaviour. That distinction matters more than it first appears, because once a river becomes famous in its shape, people begin to assume that shape explains the reality. They see continuity and imagine continuity of travel, continuity of control, continuity of understanding. If the line is unbroken, surely the river itself must be followable in the same way. Surely one can just go along it, as if the water were a railway and the earth had kindly arranged itself to support the idea. The earth in this case has not been that accommodating. A river on a map does not show you what movement feels like along its banks. It does not show you where the ground hardens into rock or softens into mud, or vanishes into reeds. It does not show you the places where a boat must stop, where a road veers away, where a marsh spreads the water into a labyrinth, or where a channel that looked perfectly sensible from a satellite turns out to be shallow, clogged, seasonal, or wildly inconvenient to anybody hoping for a grand onward journey. The map suggests one clean passage. The river offers sections, interruptions, detours and decisions. Even the width of the line misleads. On a map, the Nile looks proportionate, a nice visible stripe. But in life, a river is never only the water you see at one moment. It includes flood history, bank conditions, nearby settlements, vegetation, seasonal change, insects, silt, crossing points, local knowledge, and all the accumulated habits of people who have lived with it longer than any visitor. In some places, the river is a route. In others, it is a border. In others, it is a puzzle. And sometimes it is all three before lunch. There is also the matter of scale, which maps manage with a kind of serene dishonesty. You look at Central and Eastern Africa laid out on a page, and distance turns into abstraction. Lakes sit pleasantly apart. Borders appear crisp. Tributaries join with cartographic confidence. But then one remembers that these are not polite little European rivers meandering between weekend cafes. This is a vast river system crossing immense differences in climate and terrain. A bend that looks modest on a printed page may represent a journey of difficult days. A swamp that fits neatly into a coloured area may swallow effort, time, machinery, patience, and whatever optimism you had left from breakfast. Then there are the cataracts, which on a map can look almost decorative. The word itself has a certain elegance to it. Cataract. One imagines sparkle, perhaps a bit of mist, maybe a scenic pause. In river travel terms, however, cataracts are often the river saying no. Rocks, rapids, broken water, difficult navigation. The Nile has several such interruptions, and they mattered enormously. They shaped travel, settlement, military movement, trade, and political control. On paper, they are marks. In life, they are obstacles with consequences, and that, perhaps, is the larger theme here. The map reduces consequence. It gives you location without friction. The real Nile is full of friction. Environmental friction, historical friction, human friction. You do not simply move through the Nile's world unchanged, because the Nile's world is not one condition repeated for thousands of kilometers. It is not a single corridor in the way people lazily imagine. It is a chain of different realities stitched together by water. Some stretches invite settlement, others resist it. Some are navigable for part of the year and less so at another time. Some are deeply tied to ancient patterns of life. Some have been transformed by modern engineering. Some are watched, governed, disputed, regulated. Some are remote enough to make remoteness feel like an active force. And all of that vanishes the moment the river becomes a blue line in an atlas. This is one reason the Nile has so often been misunderstood by those approaching it from far away. They arrive with the map in their mind before they arrive with their body. The mind says, I see the river. The body arrives and discovers heat, uncertainty, distance, paperwork, mud, rock, shallow channels, seasonal timing, and the remarkable fact that local boatmen tend to know vastly more than visiting romantics. The map also encourages a habit of thinking from north to south, or south to north, as if these were merely directional choices. In reality, these directions can mean profoundly different experiences. Moving downstream sounds easy, until one remembers that easy compared to what is not the same as easy. Moving upstream sounds straightforward until one recalls that rivers are not corridors built for human convenience. Wind, current, river shape, obstacles, vessel type, and local conditions all matter. For ancient and medieval travellers, for imperial expeditions, for traders, for pilgrims, for armies, the Nile was not merely present. It imposed terms. This is why descriptions of the river often change depending on who is speaking. To a farmer, a certain stretch of the Nile may be dependable and generous. To a state administrator, it may be taxable. To a boat captain, it may be treacherous in places and manageable in others. To an outsider with a map and a fantasy of discovery, it may feel infuriatingly resistant to becoming one neat narrative. The same river, and yet not the same river at all. Another thing the map conceals is time. Not time in the grand philosophical sense, though the Nile certainly has enough of that to keep historians awake longer than intended. No, time in the practical sense. Seasonal time, flood time, dry time, travel time, waiting time. Rivers are not static objects. They change by season, by year, by intervention, by sediment load, by rainfall patterns far away from where you happen to be standing. The Nile you meet in 1 month is not exactly the Nile you would meet in another. Water levels shift, banks change, conditions alter. Some routes open, some become miserable, some become impossible, and yet the map remains composed. It never panics. It never says, to be clear, this apparent simplicity is temporary and largely decorative. Perhaps that is why maps are so seductive. They replace the experience of landscape with the idea of landscape. That is often useful. It is also dangerous, especially with a river like the Nile, whose fame has encouraged generations of people to imagine that visibility equals comprehension. We have seen it on maps for so long that we mistake repeated viewing for understanding. There is a difference between locating a river and knowing what kind of world gathers around it. The Nile gathers worlds, entire historical worlds, languages, kingdoms, transport systems, sacred geographies, farming rhythms, flood memories, trading links, border anxieties, ecological pressures. In one place, the river is an artery of life through dry country. In another, it is fed by rains falling far away in highlands. In another, it slows into huge wetland regions where water spreads and lingers, instead of hurrying along for the convenience of explorers. The map gives you connection. Life gives you complexity. You can see this especially clearly when you compare the Nile to the fantasy version of exploration that many people still carry around. In that fantasy, you arrive at the edge of a great river and follow it as though the earth had prepared an itinerary. There are hardships, naturally, because narratives enjoy a little suffering. But the route itself remains conceptually simple. Forward. The real Nile laughs softly at this arrangement and produces a marsh, a cataract, a border, a logistical delay, and perhaps a mosquito of unusual confidence. This does not mean the river is unknowable. It means that knowing it requires giving up the map's illusion of instant coherence. You must allow the Nile to be uneven in your mind, fragmented, different in different places, known deeply in parts, badly in others, and always shaped by whoever is doing the looking. The lower Nile, known to ancient Egyptians, was not the same as the upper reaches imagined by Greeks and Romans. The Nile pursued by 19th century Europeans was not the Nile lived by local populations. The Nile measured by hydrologists is not identical to the Nile remembered by communities shaped by flood and change. And the Nile seen by a tourist from a hotel deck is certainly not the Nile faced by someone trying to move through difficult country with unreliable transport and a great deal too much equipment. One might say this is unfair to maps, and perhaps it is. After all, maps are not novels. They cannot include every inconvenience. Their job is to show relation, not experience. Quite right. But with the Nile, the gap between relation and experience becomes especially dramatic. Because the line is so famous, we forget how much has been omitted to make it appear that simple. Look again, mentally, at that blue stroke across the continent. It looks singular, but the Nile is fed by different systems with different characteristics. It looks stable, but parts of its world are seasonally dynamic. It looks continuous, but continuity of water is not continuity of easy passage. It looks accessible, but access depends on terrain, technology, politics and local conditions. It looks finished, as if mapped means mastered, but mapped is only mapped. The river itself remains gloriously unbothered by our sense of completion. In fact, the more perfectly a map outlines the Nile, the more it can encourage the wrong kind of confidence. It tempts people to ask, why was this ever hard to understand? Why did it take so long to trace? Why all the confusion, the searching, the debates, the failed attempts, the obsession with sources? Surely once one sees the system, the mystery is over, only if one mistakes shape for reality. Because geography from above is not the same as geography lived from within. The Nile in real life does not present itself as a solved diagram. It presents itself piece by piece, stretch by stretch, reach by reach, one environment giving way to another, one community's knowledge ending where another begins, one practical certainty collapsing in the face of a marsh, a rapid, a distance, a season, or a political barrier. And that is before we even reach the deeper puzzle of beginnings. For that is where the map becomes most treacherous of all. It suggests that if a river is visible, its source must be merely a matter of tracing the line backward until one reaches the point where the line begins. A child can do it with a pencil. What could be simpler? But rivers do not always begin in a single theatrical place. They gather. They branch. They inherit water from multiple systems. They emerge from landscapes where the beginning depends very much on what one means by beginning. And the Nile, being the Nile, turns even that seemingly straightforward question into a long, stubborn, historically expensive headache. So before anyone set out to chase the source, before expeditions filled with confidence and supplies, and the occasional deeply misplaced sense of superiority pushed southward, the real problem had already been set by the river itself, The map had made the Nile look singular. Life had made it multiple. The map had made it look continuous. Terrain had made it interrupted. The map had made it look followable. Reality had made it conditional, which is why, once people started asking where the Nile truly begins, they were no longer dealing with a neat blue line on paper. They were dealing with a river that had already refused simplification, and that refusal only grows sharper when the hunt for the first beginning finally starts. Once people began asking where the Nile truly begins, they also began revealing something slightly awkward about themselves. We do love a clean answer. We like a starting point, a first page, a front door. We want to be able to point at one little spot on the earth and say, there, that is where the river starts, and now we can all go home feeling organised. It is a very human wish. It is also, in the case of the Nile, the sort of wish that leads to arguments, long journeys, damp notebooks, and the occasional gentleman declaring victory much too early. Because the Nile does not begin in the tidy storybook way people hoped. It gathers, it borrows, it inherits. And the farther people chased its beginning, the more the river kept responding with the geographical version of, that depends what you mean. For a very long time, the Nile's lower reaches were deeply familiar to the people who lived beside them. But familiarity with one part of a river is not the same as certainty about all of it. The ancient Egyptians almost certainly knew the Nile northward and southward far better than many later outsiders gave them credit for. They were probably familiar with the river as far as Khartoum and with the Blue Nile to Lake Tana, yet the ultimate source of the Nile, especially the White Nile, remained unknown to them. Even Herodotus, who travelled in Egypt in the 5th century BCE and was never knowingly underconfident about anything, only went as far as the First Cataract. Centuries later, a Roman expedition sent under Nero tried to push farther south in search of the source, only to be checked by the Al-Sud, that vast wetland barrier in what is now South Sudan. The river, already famous, was making a simple point very early on. You may admire me, you may depend on me, you may worship me, tax me, and write poems about me, but following me all the way to the beginning is another matter. That detail matters because the search for the source is often told as if it began in the 19th century with a few very determined Europeans and some aggressively polished boots. In fact, people had been curious for much longer. Greek writers speculated, Roman officials attempted expeditions. Medieval and early modern travellers heard reports from traders, clerics, and local communities. And then, in the 17th century, a Spanish Jesuit priest named Pedro Paez reached what he identified as the source of the Blue Nile in Ethiopia in 1618. More than a century later, the Scottish traveller James Bruce visited Lake Tana and the Blue Nile source in 1770 and became far more famous for it, which feels very on brand for the history of exploration. Arriving matters apparently, but public relations helps. What is important here is that by the late 18th century, the Blue Nile had a source story that Europeans could point to with some confidence. The trouble was that this still did not solve the larger Nile mystery, because the Nile was not only the Blue Nile, it was also the longer, slower, far more elusive White Nile system, and that was where the headache really began. Now here is where the river becomes delightfully unhelpful to anyone who wants a single winner. The Blue Nile matters enormously. It rises near Lake Tana in Ethiopia, runs through rapids and deep country, and contributes the overwhelming share of the floodwater that historically reached Egypt. At Khartoum, it is the Blue Nile that brings most of the drama, most of the force, and a great deal of the silt that shaped life downstream. If your definition of the real Nile source is the branch that made ancient Egypt's yearly flood such a powerful event, then the Blue Nile makes a strong case for itself. It is the energetic one, the seasonally dramatic one, the branch that arrives like someone who was told dinner started at 7 and takes that as a suggestion to enter loudly at 8:30. But if your definition of source is the longest continuous headwater system, then the White Nile starts giving you that polite, maddening look rivers reserve for people asking oversimplified questions. The White Nile is longer, calmer in places, and far harder to reduce to a single dramatic spring. It is tied to the Great Lakes region of East Africa, and for 19th century Europeans that region became the stage for one of the most famous geographical hunts in modern history. Richard Burton and John Hanning Speke reached Lake Tanganyika in 1858. While Burton was ill, Speke pushed north and became the first European to see Lake Victoria. He came away convinced that this immense lake was the long-sought source of the Nile. It was a bold claim, and to be fair to him, not an unreasonable one. Lake Victoria clearly fed the river system northward. The difficulty was that seeing a lake is not quite the same as proving a source in the rigorous sense, and Burton did not accept Speke's conclusion. The two men disagreed bitterly, which added an especially human layer to the whole affair. The Nile, meanwhile, remained entirely unbothered by their professional tension. Speke returned to East Africa in 1860 with James Augustus Grant, and in 1862 reached the point where water leaves Lake Victoria at Ripon Falls, in modern Uganda. For Speke, this was confirmation. Here was the lake outlet flowing north into the Victoria Nile. In the older European story of exploration, this moment often gets presented as the mystery solved, trumpets sounding, maps corrected, everyone very pleased with themselves. And yet the more carefully you look, the less final it becomes. Yes, Lake Victoria feeds the Nile through its northern outlet. Yes, Speke was right to connect the lake to the Nile system. But even Lake Victoria is not a first beginning in the strictest sense. It is itself fed by many inflows, and its water comes not only from rivers but heavily from rainfall over the lake's surface. So even when the hunt appeared to have reached a grand conclusion, the river quietly shifted the goalposts. Lake found, outlet traced, applause politely accepted. But what feeds the lake? And what do we actually mean by source? That is the point where a romantic quest turns into hydrology. And hydrology, though not always invited to dinner parties, is usually where rivers become honest. Lake Victoria's largest and most important tributary is the Kagera River, and many descriptions now treat the Kagera, rising in Burundi through headstreams in the highlands near Rwanda and the Congo region, as the most remote headstream of the Nile. If your rule is that the source of a river is its farthest continuous feeder, then the Kagera becomes your answer. But then Lake Victoria reminds everyone that rainfall supplies much of its water, so the lake is not merely a bucket waiting for one river to fill it. It is part of a more complicated water system. In other words, even the supposedly exact answer comes with footnotes. The Nile does not reward the hunt for a single origin. It rewards patience, nuance, and a willingness to admit that the neatest answer is not always the truest one. And after Lake Victoria, the water still has a long and complicated life ahead of it. It flows out as the Victoria Nile, moves through Uganda, passes through rapids and waterfalls, continues toward Lake Albert, and then northward into South Sudan, where the river enters one of the great practical arguments against simple exploration, the Al Sud. Here the river slows, spreads, tangles, and loses more than half the Al Jabal's water through evaporation. It becomes not a single obedient route, but a wetland barrier that has frustrated movement for centuries. This matters because even if one were to say very well, let us follow the White Nile back from Egypt toward its beginning, the river system does not offer a straightforward reverse path. It offers a swamp large enough to humble empires, maps, expeditions, and all the usual bravado. More than one search for the source ended not because human curiosity failed, but because reeds, water, heat, and scale had other plans. There is another wrinkle here, and it is worth saying plainly. The famous search for the source of the Nile is often narrated as though the river did not meaningfully exist, until European explorers verified it to one another in writing. That is nonsense, of course. Local communities knew these waters. Traders moved through related regions. Political powers in northeast Africa and Ethiopia had long experience with branches of the Nile system. The ancient Egyptians probably knew the Blue Nile to Lake Tana. People living around the lakes and along the river's upper reaches did not require an outsider's medal ceremony. to confirm that the water was there. What 19th century expeditions really did was fold the river into European geographical debate and imperial knowledge. They turned lived landscapes into contested points on someone else's map. That is not the same thing as discovering a river. It is closer to filing it under a new management system and then speaking rather loudly about the achievement. Even within those European debates, certainty remained slippery. Burton and Speke disagreed. Different definitions of source competed with one another. Some people favoured the branch most important to Egypt's flood, which pointed toward the Blue Nile and Ethiopia. Others favoured the longest route, which pointed into the White Nile system and eventually toward Lake Victoria, and beyond that the Kagera headwaters. Others focused on visible lake outlets, or on what could actually be reached and demonstrated by expedition. So the famous source hunt did not end with one universally satisfying answer. It split into categories: most distant headstream, main lake outlet, most hydrologically important tributary, best known ancient flood source. This is the sort of thing that makes geographers nod thoughtfully and everyone else slowly reach for another biscuit. But the categories matter because they reveal the central truth. The Nile is not one simple line with one indisputable first drop. It is a river system whose beginnings depend on which question you're asking, and perhaps that is why chasing the source has remained such a powerful story. Not because it ended cleanly, but because it did not. The search promised a heroic finish and delivered a lesson in definitions instead. It offered explorers a chance at one triumphant answer and handed them lakes, tributaries, swamps, seasonal flows, and a river that kept saying, "Be more specific." That may sound disappointing if what you wanted was a single dramatic spring bubbling out beneath a sacred tree while someone nearby writes in a leather journal. But in another sense it is much more interesting. The Nile forces us to admit that rivers are processes, not just lines. They are networks. They are moving relationships between rainfall, ground, altitude, channels, wetlands, lakes, and time. The river begins, if we insist on that word, in more than one place and in more than one way. It begins in headstreams, in highland rain, in lake basins, in seasonal pulses, in landscapes that refuse to behave like a clean answer. So the old hunt for the Nile's beginning did something rather useful, even while failing to produce the kind of neat-ending people like to carve into schoolbook paragraphs. It exposed the river's character. It showed that the Nile is famous enough to tempt simplification and complicated enough to punish it. It showed that one branch can be longer, while another can matter more to flood and sediment. It showed that a lake can look like an answer until you ask what feeds the lake. It showed that a river can be mapped, named, and argued over without becoming simple. And it showed that the dream of tracing the Nile to one absolute first point was never really a dream about water at all. It was a dream about certainty. The Nile, with considerable patience and a very old sense of humour, declined to provide it. Which leaves us exactly where the river seems to enjoy leaving people, at the edge of a more uncomfortable and more truthful idea. The Nile does not have one beginning that settles the matter. It has several beginnings, and that is where the story has to go next. What makes the Nile so difficult to pin down is not only that its source was hard to reach, it is that the river refuses to have just one beginning in the first place. That sounds like the sort of sentence people use when they are trying to sound mysterious about something that could probably be explained with a decent diagram. In this case, though, the diagram is exactly where the trouble begins. Because once you start looking closely at how the Nile is formed, where its water comes from, and what people actually mean when they say the source, you discover that several different answers are reasonable, and none of them fully cancels the others. Britannica's own description puts it plainly. It is generally agreed that the Nile has several sources rather than one. That creates a problem for the old explorer's dream. The dream depends on one final point, one clear beginning, one place to stand and say, "This is it." But rivers are not built to satisfy that kind of ceremony. Some are simpler than others, and some at least have the courtesy to give a fairly direct answer. The Nile is not one of those rivers. It is a system of systems fed by lakes, tributaries, highland rains, and seasonal flows that do not all behave in the same way. So when people speak of the Nile's beginning, they're often talking past one another without realizing it. One person may mean the place where the river first bears the name Nile. Another may mean the farthest possible headstream. Another may mean the branch that contributes the most water or the most important flood. All of those are different questions, and the Nile is impolite enough to answer each of them differently. If you want the beginning of the Nile proper, the official seeming version, the one that sounds suitable for a school map and a very confident voiceover, then the answer lies at Lake Victoria. Britannica notes that the Nile proper rises from Lake Victoria and begins near Jinja, Uganda, on the lake's north shore, historically flowing out over Ripon Falls before that site was altered by the dam built in the mid-20th century. That is a perfectly respectable beginning. It is visible. It is nameable. It gives you a point on the map and the pleasant feeling that geography has behaved itself for once. If a person stood there and said, "Here begins the Nile," no one would have to drag them away for speaking nonsense. The river does indeed leave Lake Victoria there and continue northward as the Victoria Nile. The difficulty is that Lake Victoria is not a tap. It is not a self-contained origin point politely generating Nile water out of thin air. It is a huge natural reservoir, a shallow inland sea in practical terms, and what flows out of it first has to arrive there. That means the question shifts backward. What feeds the lake? Britannica says the outflow from Lake Victoria comes mostly from rivers draining into it, particularly the Kagera, even though heavy rainfall over the lake itself is also an important part of the water balance. So the neat answer at Jinja immediately starts to fray. Yes, the Nile proper begins there, but the water did not. It came from farther away, through a network of inflows that forced the beginning farther upstream and farther into argument. That is why so many geographers and hydrologists treat the Kagera River as the Nile's most distant headstream. Britannica describes the Kagera, rising in the highlands of Burundi and flowing into Lake Victoria, as the furthest headstream that may be regarded as the source. That gives the Nile a beginning much farther south than many people imagine, and it gives the river a much less theatrical starting point than the word source tends to suggest. Instead of one sacred spring solving the matter, you get headwaters in high country, streams feeding streams, and a long chain of movement before the river even reaches the lake that many people casually call its source. In other words, the farther beginning is not a dramatic finish line for explorers. It is a reminder that large rivers are often assembled rather than simply born. Even that does not quite settle things, because Lake Victoria complicates the story again. Britannica's hydrology section notes that heavy rainfall over the lake is nearly balanced by evaporation, while the lake's outflow comes mostly from rivers draining into it, especially the Kagera. That means the lake is not just receiving river water from outside, it is also part of a regional rainfall system. So if someone insists that the true beginning of the Nile must be where the actual water originates, then we are no longer dealing only with a headstream. We are dealing with rains over the East African plateau and over the lake basin itself. At that point, the word beginning starts to sound less like a location and more like an uncomfortable conversation between meteorology and geography. Quite right too. The Nile was always larger than a spring. The White Nile, which carries this lake-fed water northward, only deepens the complication. It is longer than the Blue Nile and is often treated as the headwaters branch of the Nile system. But even the White Nile is not one simple linear thing with one tidy first step. Britannica describes the White Nile section between Malakal and Khartoum as being formed by the confluence of the Mountain Nile or Bahr al-Jabal and the Sobat River. The total length of the White Nile, including the Mountain Nile, runs far beyond that stretch, and the branch is notable for its steady year-round contribution. In other words, by the time people talk about the White Nile, they're already talking about a river assembled from earlier rivers, lake outflows, and inflows that meet, regulate, and replace one another. Even the main branch behaves less like a simple beginning and more like a sequence of mergers. The White Nile's water also comes from more than one important source region. Britannica says that during the low water months of April and May, more than 80% of the main Nile's water comes from the White Nile. Yet the White Nile itself gets its water in roughly equal amounts from two main sources: rainfall on the East African plateau from the previous summer and drainage from southwestern Ethiopia through the Sobat system, especially the Barrow and Pibor. That is a remarkable detail, because it means that even the branch people often imagine as the calm, steady answer to the Nile question is being fed from different climatic zones and through different hydrological routes. One beginning turns into two, and then each of those begins to subdivide. By this stage, if a river were a family tree, the Nile would already require a larger piece of paper. Then there is the matter of the Al-Sud, which makes the White Nile even less obedient to the idea of a straightforward origin. Water from the Great Lakes moves north into the Al-Jabal and then into this enormous swamp region in South Sudan, where, according to Britannica, about half the water is lost by seepage and evaporation before the Sobat nearly makes up the loss farther downstream. That means the Nile's northern continuity depends not just on where water starts, but on what survives the journey. A beginning, in the Nile's case, is not enough by itself. Water must also endure lakes, swamps, evaporation, and later reinforcement. The river is constantly being reassembled. It is less like a single thread pulled through the continent, and more like a rope repeatedly twisted from different strands. Now consider the Blue Nile, because here the whole argument changes shape. The White Nile may be longer, steadier, and easier to defend if you're asking about headwaters, but the Blue Nile is the branch that historically mattered most to Egypt's annual flood. Britannica states that the Blue Nile is the source of almost 70% of the floodwater at Khartoum, and that historically its flood surge contributed most to the annual Nile floods in Egypt. So if a person in ancient or medieval Egypt had asked, in practical terms, where the Nile's life-giving rise really came from, the most meaningful answer would not have been Uganda or Burundi. It would have pointed eastward, toward the Ethiopian highlands and the monsoon rains that swelled the Blue Nile. That is another beginning. Not the longest one, perhaps, but the one that made the river downstream behave the way it did. The Blue Nile has its own source story, and it too is less simple than legend prefers. Britannica describes the Blue Nile as rising as the Abay from a spring near Lake Tana in northwestern Ethiopia. The river then flows into and out of the lake, runs through rapids, and drops into a deep gorge before continuing into Sudan to join the White Nile at Khartoum. That gives you yet another beginning that looks satisfyingly source-like. A spring, a name, a dramatic landscape, a branch with immense historical importance. It is no wonder that earlier explorers and writers found the Blue Nile easier to treat as a solved problem than the White Nile. It offers something that feels more like a proper source in the old heroic sense. You can go there, point, nod, and feel that geography has finally agreed to cooperate. But then the Blue Nile refuses to stay neatly solved. Britannica also notes that Lake Tana supplies only a small part of the river's total flow, and that by far the greater part of the Blue Nile's waters come from tributaries such as the Dinda and Rahad, which rise in the Ethiopian highlands. So even here, where the river seems to offer a cleaner beginning, the real water budget pushes outward into a broader upland system. The spring matters, Lake Tana matters, yet the seasonal force that makes the Blue Nile so important comes from wider rains and tributaries across the plateau. Once again, the Nile's beginning is not fully contained in one place. It sits across a region. You can name the spring, but you cannot honestly pretend the spring alone explains the river. The Atbara adds one more complication, just to make sure no one leaves with an oversimplified diagram. Britannica identifies the Nile as being formed by three principal streams: the White Nile, the Blue Nile, and the Atbara, all of which play different roles. The Atbara rises in Ethiopia, contributes more than 10% of the Nile's total annual flow, and, like the Blue Nile, brings most of that water during the flood season from July to October. It is not usually the star of the source discussion, which feels a little unfair, but it matters because it reminds us that the Nile's downstream behaviour depends on several Ethiopian-fed pulses, not only one. The farther north you look, the less the river's life can be traced back to a single place or a single branch. It is a composite river in the fullest sense. This is why different people can each give an answer about the Nile's beginning and all still be making sense. A guide at Ginger can say the Nile begins where it leaves Lake Victoria, and that is true in the named river sense. A geographer can say the farthest headstream is the Kagera in Burundi, and that is true in the longest source sense. A hydrologist can point out that rainfall over the East African lake region and the Sobat Basin is essential to the White Nile's steady flow, and that is true in terms of water supply. A historian of Egypt can say the most important beginning for the old flood came from the Ethiopian plateau through the Blue Nile, and that is true in terms of downstream consequence. They are not really contradicting one another. They are using different rules for the same river. The Nile is not breaking logic. It is simply too large for one kind of logic to contain it. There is also a more human lesson buried in all this. The search for a single beginning tells us as much about our preferences as it does about the river. We want rivers to behave like stories, with one opening sentence and a clear road forward. The Nile behaves more like a long administrative file compiled by weather, topography, lakes, tributaries, and time. Every time someone thinks they have found the first page, another earlier page appears from underneath it. Lake Victoria is not early enough. The Kagera is not complete enough. The Blue Nile is too important to ignore. The Sobat intrudes. Rainfall complicates everything. Even the most patient map begins to look slightly tired. That is part of what made the old source hunt so frustrating and so famous. Explorers often believed they were searching for one answer. What they kept finding instead were different valid beginnings that answered different versions of the question. They could identify the Blue Nile's source and still not settle the White Nile. They could connect Lake Victoria to the Nile and still not close the matter of the most distant headstream. They could trace a branch farther south and still have to admit that branch was not the one responsible for the great flood pulse that shaped Egypt. The Nile kept dividing the question every time someone tried to simplify it. That is not a flaw in the river. It is the correct description of a very large basin. And once you accept that, the old phrase, source of the Nile, starts to sound a little too narrow for what the river actually is. There is no shame in using it. Everyone uses it. But it works best when treated as shorthand rather than absolute truth. The Nile has several beginnings because its water, its movement, and its historical importance do not all begin in the same place. The named river begins at one point. The longest route begins farther away. The most reliable base flow comes through one set of systems. The great seasonal surge comes through another. If you're trying to understand why the Nile has never yielded easily to the fantasy of complete exploration, this is one of the main reasons. It does not invite a single path backward. It invites a series of competing paths, each leading into a different landscape with different conditions and different problems. So the Nile is not merely a river with a hidden source. It is a river with more than one credible beginning, and that means every attempt to find it is already making a choice about what counts. That choice may be reasonable. It may even be scientifically useful. But it is still a choice. Which is why the deeper one goes into the Nile's geography, the less the river resembles a line, and the more it resembles a spread of waters shaped by different climates, elevations, basins, and seasons. And that is before we even come to the landscapes through which those waters have to move. Because once the Nile leaves its many beginnings and starts trying to become one river, it runs straight into marshes, deserts, shifting channels, and water that has never been especially eager to stay put. The old dream of exploring the Nile from beginning to end depends on a very generous assumption. It assumes the river behaves like a route, something you can follow, something that stays enough like itself from one stretch to the next that a determined person, a boat, a few supplies, and a strong sense of narrative destiny can simply continue onward until the matter is settled. That is not how the Nile behaves. Not for long anyway, because even after you accept that the river has more than one beginning, there is still the minor inconvenience of the landscapes those beginnings must pass through, and those landscapes do not make life easy. Some dry the river's world down to a narrow band of survival. Some spread the water out so widely that the river stops looking like a line at all. Some turn movement into patience. Some turn patience into failure. Put all of that together, and what you get is not one river waiting to be traced, but a long sequence of environments that keep changing the rules. A map hides that beautifully. It lets the Nile look like a continuous strip of blue, and in a technical sense that is true enough to be dangerous. But continuity of water is not continuity of passage. A river can remain connected on paper while becoming deeply inconvenient in practice. In the case of the Nile, this is one of the main reasons the fantasy of true exploration starts wobbling the moment it meets the ground. South of the Sahara, north of the Great Lakes, east of Central Africa, and west of the Ethiopian highlands, the river keeps entering regions that reshape it. One part narrows and flows through dry country, another part slows into broad wetlands, another is altered by seasonal surges, another is interrupted by rock and cataracts, another is fed by heavy summer rains far away from where the water will eventually be used. The basin itself spans climates that are wildly different from one another. Sudan and Egypt are largely rainless in the northern winter, while the highlands of Ethiopia and the southern parts of the basin receive heavy summer rains, often more than 60 inches a year. So the river you meet in one place is often being controlled by weather somewhere else entirely. That alone is enough to make certainty difficult. Take the desert first, because deserts tend to look simple from a distance and then become rude in person. In Egypt and northern Sudan, the Nile passes through country where water is not merely useful but decisive. Life gathers around it because there is little sensible alternative. The river becomes a narrow corridor of cultivation and settlement set against immense dry land. That image is familiar for a reason. It is one of the most recognizable river landscapes on Earth. But even here, where the Nile appears most legible, the desert changes what exploration means. A river in dry country may seem easy to follow because it stands out so clearly, yet the surrounding land offers fewer easy detours, fewer resources, and fewer forgiving margins for error. Stray too far from the water, and conditions deteriorate quickly. Stay with the water, and the water itself may not cooperate. The famous corridor is not a comfortable hallway. It is a demanding strip between harsh alternatives. That can make movement possible in one sense, and tightly constrained in another. Then the river moves into zones where the opposite problem appears. Not too little water, but too much water behaving badly. Or, perhaps more fairly, too much water behaving exactly as water behaves when left to its own devices across flat ground. This is where the Sud enters the story, and if the desert makes the Nile look like a line, the Sud does the exact reverse. In South Sudan, the Bahr el-Jabal spreads into one of the world's great wetlands, an area so large and so difficult that it has frustrated movement for centuries. Britannica describes the Sud as an almost impenetrable barrier to navigation, and it notes that the Al-Jabal loses more than half its water there through evaporation. That is a remarkable thing for a famous river to do. People imagine rivers gathering strength as they travel. The Nile, in this reach, wanders into a marsh and misplaces a great deal of itself. The water slows, spreads, and lingers among channels, lagoons, papyrus, reeds, and floating vegetation. What looked from afar like a route becomes a maze with mosquitoes, and that maze matters more than any romantic tale of source hunting sometimes admits. Because the Sud is not just scenic difficulty, it is structural difficulty. It breaks the explorer's preferred logic of forward movement. In a tidy river journey, you go upstream or downstream. In the Sud, the river often ceases to look like one obedient stream doing one sensible thing. Channels divide, vegetation shifts, flooded ground changes extent with season and inflow. distance becomes slippery because the water may be near you without offering a straightforward way through. The White Nile system remains connected, yes, but the landscape around it does not present itself in a way that flatters human plans. That is why ancient attempts from the north stalled there, and why later efforts had such difficulty converting mapped knowledge into bodily passage. A wetland can be known in principle, and still remain extremely unpleasant to cross in practice. There is nothing mystical about that. It's simply what happens when shallow gradients, broad floodplains, vegetation, heat and water decide to collaborate. The White Nile itself encourages this kind of trouble even outside the deepest marsh. Britannica describes the White Nile north of Malakal as a wide placid stream running through a wide shallow valley, with considerable loss of water by evaporation and seepage. That sounds calm, and calm rivers are often underestimated. People hear placid and think manageable. But placid does not always mean easy. A wide, shallow valley is exactly the sort of place where a river can spread, slow, and become less efficient as a channel of movement. It remains important hydrologically, especially in the dry months when the White Nile contributes more than 80% of the main Nile's flow at Khartoum. But hydrological importance and travel convenience are not the same thing. A river can be vital and still make itself awkward. One begins to suspect the Nile enjoys this arrangement. The Blue Nile complicates matters in a different way. It is not the swampy, slow-breathing side of the family. It is the urgent one, the one driven by summer monsoon rains over the Ethiopian plateau. Britannica notes that the Blue Nile has a pronounced flood season from late July to October, and historically supplied most of the annual Nile flood in Egypt. It also points out that when the Blue Nile is in flood, it can hold back the White Nile at Khartoum, turning it into an extensive lake and delaying its northward flow. That is an astonishing image if one stops to think about it. Two great branches meet, and one arrives with such force that it temporarily changes the behaviour of the other. This is not a stable corridor waiting to be toured. It is a river system whose parts can overpower one another depending on season. Try building a simple story of exploration on top of that, and you quickly find yourself in trouble. The Ethiopian connection matters for another reason as well. So much of the Nile's downstream behaviour depends on rains falling far from Egypt itself. The Blue Nile and the Atbara both rise in Ethiopia, and together they carry much of the floodwater and silt northward. In practical terms, that means the Lower Nile cannot be fully understood just by standing beside it in Egypt and observing dutifully. Its life is being partly written somewhere else, in uplands, tributaries, and seasonal weather systems that may be out of sight and far away. Rivers often do this, of course, but the Nile does it on a scale that has shaped civilizations. The old Egyptian farmer waiting for the flood was, in a sense, waiting on Ethiopian rain. The river linked distant climates into one downstream fate. This is useful if you're writing a history of interdependence. It is less useful if you hope the Nile would politely explain itself one stretch at a time. And while all of that water is behaving differently by region, the river is also running into stone. North of Khartoum, the Nile enters the long desert reaches where cataracts have historically broken navigation into separate sections. Britannica notes that because of these cataracts, the river in Sudan has been navigable only in 3 stretches. This is one of those facts that looks harmless in print and then ruins your expedition. A cataract is not merely a scenic interruption. It is the river refusing to be one smooth road. Rocks, rapids, broken channels, difficult passage. Boats may need unloading, cargo may need carrying, movement may halt, control may be localized, and what looked like one connected route on paper becomes several routes with unpleasant joins. The Nile's cataracts shaped trade, political boundaries, military movement, and settlement for good reason. They forced the river to be taken in segments. Exploration, if it happened in pieces. This is where the desert and marsh begin to look strangely similar, despite being opposites. The desert narrows the world until life clings to the river. The marsh broadens the river until the route dissolves into wetland. One gives you too little margin, the other gives you too much undirected space. In both cases, the tidy idea of simply following the Nile starts to break down. The same thing happens with seasonal change. A stretch that is passable at one water level may not be at another. A branch that seems significant in one period may become less useful in another. A flood pulse can transform one region while leaving another relatively steady. Even the White Nile and Blue Nile do not contribute in the same way all year. During the flood season, the White Nile's share at Khartoum drops below 30% because the Blue Nile arrives with such force. During low water, the White Nile becomes the more dependable supplier. The river is not fixed enough to support one all-purpose description. It must be spoken of in terms of place and season. This is also why maps and photographs, useful though they are, have limits when applied to the Nile. A satellite image can show the Sudd's extent. It can trace channels, lakes and bends. It can reveal the river's broad path through desert and plain. But it does not automatically convert that view into usable human movement. A channel visible from above may be choked below. A floodplain may look continuous while being difficult underfoot. A navigable-looking reach may end in rock or reeds or administrative restrictions. That is not a failure of modern technology. It is simply the difference between seeing terrain and inhabiting terrain. The Nile has always exploited that difference. It looks coherent at scale and troublesome up close. There is another point here that often gets missed because the words desert and swamp sound like scenery rather than systems. They are not passive backgrounds. They actively reshape what the river does. In the desert, the Nile becomes the central organizer of life, which means every bend matters because alternatives are limited. In the Sudd, the river becomes diffuse, which means every channel matters because the route itself is unstable. In the Ethiopian fed sections, the seasonal pulse matters because it reorders the river downstream. Add cataracts to the equation, and the Nile becomes a chain of forced adjustments. Not one river, then onward, then finished. More like one long negotiation. Water negotiating with slope, heat, evaporation, rock, vegetation, rainfall and distance. Humans merely arrive later and try to pretend they are in charge. This helps explain why the Nile is both so famous and so resistant to being fully done. A person can travel on the Nile, certainly. People have done so for thousands of years. They have fished it, crossed it, farmed beside it, prayed over it, fought along it, and measured it. But those are not the same as reducing it to one complete route that can be known in a single sweep. The river is too segmented by conditions. Its desert reaches tell one story. Its marshes tell another. Its highland-fed branches tell another. Its rocky interruptions tell another again. Any attempt to explore the whole thing in a single conceptual gesture is forced to keep changing methods because the river keeps changing character. There is a quiet irony in that. The Nile is often introduced as one of the great unifying features of northeastern Africa, and in one sense it is. It links regions that would otherwise be sharply divided. It carries water northward across immense distance. It joins climatic zones, societies and histories into one long-connected system. Yet from the point of view of movement, it is also a divider. Cataracts split navigation. Marshes dissolve routes. Flood regimes alter timing. Deserts constrain survival. The river connects and obstructs at the same time. That is a much less comfortable story than the old heroic one, but it is a much more accurate one. By now, the pattern is becoming difficult to ignore. The Nile is not merely hard to explore because it is long. Plenty of long rivers are difficult without turning into legends. The Nile becomes legendary because every stage of its length introduces a different kind of refusal. One reach says you cannot go straight through because the water is spread too widely. Another says you cannot proceed cleanly because rock has broken the channel. Another says the river you are following now is being transformed by rains somewhere distant. Another says yes, the line continues, but the practical conditions do not. That repeated refusal is what gives the Nile its strange reputation. It is visible enough to attract ambition, and complicated enough to embarrass it. And once people enter the picture more fully, matters become even less cooperative. Because a river moving through deserts, marshes, and shifting channels does not pass through empty geography. It passes through lands lived in, governed, defended, and remembered. Routes become permissions, banks become territories, crossings become political facts. The water is still behaving as inconveniently as ever, but now there are kingdoms, borders, authorities, and long histories layered over every practical obstacle the landscape had already provided, which is where the next kind of difficulty begins to take shape. By the time the Nile has already confused us with multiple beginnings, shifting wetlands, flood pulses, and stretches that will not behave like a proper route, it adds another layer of difficulty that is very easy to overlook from a comfortable distance. The river does not flow through empty scenery. It never did. It passes through lands occupied, governed, taxed, defended, fought over, and remembered by people with their own priorities, their own fears, and their own ideas about who should be allowed to move where. This is where the old fantasy of exploration becomes especially misleading. It imagines the Nile as a natural puzzle waiting to be solved by persistence. But long before any outsider arrived with notebooks and self-belief, the river had already been folded into political worlds. Passage was never only a matter of boats, current, wind, or stamina. It was also a matter of authority. Who controls this bank? Who guards that crossing? Which cataract marks a frontier? Which city taxes movement? Which kingdom treats strangers as useful, suspicious, or both? The Nile was not simply difficult because of nature. It was difficult because every difficult reach could also become a controlled reach, and the people living there were under no obligation to turn the river into a public service for ambitious visitors. Ancient Egypt understood this very well. The Nile was the country's central artery, but it was not an open hallway running politely into the unknown. Britannica notes that the first cataract at Aswan was Egypt's only well-defined boundary within a populated area, and south of it lay Nubia, where the river flowed through narrower, less hospitable terrain that mattered to Egypt both as a frontier and as a route toward products from farther south. That alone tells you something important about how the river functioned. It was a connector, yes, but it was also a threshold. The cataract was not simply a geological feature. It was the kind of place where geography and politics shake hands. Egypt pushed southward into Lower Nubia at various times, and during the Old Kingdom the Egyptians founded a settlement at Buhan near the Second Cataract, probably to establish trade farther south and to create a buffer zone. That is not the behaviour of a civilization regarding the Nile as a simple road. It is the behaviour of a state recognising choke points and trying to manage them. Rivers make movement possible, but difficult stretches decide who gets to supervise that movement, and supervision has a way of becoming power. Once you move into Nubia, that pattern only grows stronger. Nubia itself was not a blank southern extension of Egypt waiting to be entered and labelled. It was an ancient region of the Nile Valley stretching from near the first cataract southward toward Khartoum, and it developed powerful states of its own, most famously Kush. Britannica describes Kush as a region and a set of kingdoms centred in ancient Nubia, and it notes that the area around Kerma drew wealth from agriculture, cattle, gold from the eastern desert, and trade along the Nile. That is crucial. Trade along the Nile means traffic. Traffic means leverage. Leverage means someone can permit, tax, defend, or obstruct passage. Egypt and Nubia were therefore tied together not only by conquest and conflict, but by the practical reality that the river between them was too valuable to ignore and too strategic to leave unmanaged. Later, the kings of Kush became strong enough to conquer Egypt itself and rule as its 25th dynasty, which is a rather firm reminder that control along the Nile did not move in one direction forever. The river did not belong naturally to one civilization's story. It sat between powers that repeatedly tried to turn its difficult stretches into controlled gateways. The cataracts mattered enormously here because they made politics local and passage conditional. Britannica notes that outcropping crystalline rocks crossing the Nile created the famous cataracts, and that, because of them, the river was not completely navigable. Sections between the cataracts could be used by sailing vessels and later steamers, but the whole river was broken into parts rather than offered as a single continuous route. That is the kind of detail maps do not emphasize enough. A river interrupted by cataracts is not merely harder to navigate. It is easier to control. Movement must stop, unload, transfer, negotiate, or reroute. Wherever movement is forced to pause, power gathers. Whoever dominates the banks, forts, or settlements near those interruptions gains influence over everyone who wishes to continue. So when we picture ancient and medieval movement on the Nile, it is not enough to imagine boats drifting gracefully between temples. There were hard stops in the system, and every hard stop created opportunities for collection, surveillance, diplomacy, coercion, and refusal. Geography was doing half the political work before any ruler even issued an order. That is also why so many early visitors from the Mediterranean world never got very far. Herodotus, according to Britannica, travelled up the Nile only as far as the first cataract. A Roman expedition sent by Nero later tried to push south in search of the source, but was checked by the Sud. The interesting thing is that these limits were not purely about curiosity running out of steam. They reveal the combined effect of terrain and controlled access. The farther a traveller went, the more the river passed into other political and environmental worlds. Egypt's knowledge did not automatically become Roman knowledge. Roman ambition did not automatically become Roman access. Even in antiquity, the Nile reminded outsiders that a river famous at its lower end could still become opaque farther south, because the stretch ahead was governed by other conditions and other powers. There is always a tendency in older histories to present this as if the mystery lay in the landscape alone, but often the mystery lay partly in the fact that one state's reach had ended and another world had begun, one not arranged for the convenience of geographers from elsewhere. As centuries passed, the same basic truth remained in place, even though the names of the powers changed. Nubia continued to matter as a region with its own political life, and Britannica's summary notes that after the age of Kush, Nubia later became the centre of a powerful state with Dunkla as its capital before it was eventually captured by Arabs. Farther south and east, the Funj established their capital at Senna on the Blue Nile, above its confluence with the White Nile in the early 16th century, and expanded northward, while other powers contested the surrounding regions. That location was no accident. A capital near the confluence of the Blue and White Niles sits beside one of the most important meeting points in the entire system. To control such a place is to stand near a hinge of movement, trade, and regional authority. The river, in other words, kept producing political centres at exactly the places where geography made them valuable. Confluences, cataracts, narrow valleys, and cultivable strips all encourage the same habit over and over again. People settled where the Nile made settlement sensible, and rulers then tried to turn those places into durable sources of control. This makes the phrase problem of passage more literal than it might first sound. Passage along the Nile was not a single yes or no matter. It was a chain of permissions, abilities and limitations that change from one reach to the next. In one section, the problem might be current or rock. In another, it might be whether local authorities permitted movement. In another, whether the cultivable strip was too narrow for easy detour. In another, whether the river entered a region where someone else claimed the right to tax or supervise travel. Even a peaceful journey had to reckon with the simple fact that river travel is visible. A road across open land can sometimes be avoided, but a boat in a channel announces itself rather clearly. That gives river states an advantage. They know where people must pass, or at least where they are likely to try. The Nile therefore encouraged not only movement, but observation. Anyone who controlled the key reaches did not have to search very far for traffic. Traffic came to them. Modern borders only formalised what the river had long encouraged. Britannica notes that the Nile Basin spans countries including Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, and Tanzania. In institutional terms, the Nile Basin Initiative today brings together 10 basin countries, with Eritrea participating as an observer, and it was launched in 1999 as the first all-inclusive transitional arrangement among the riparian states. Those facts matter because they show how fully the Nile has become a transboundary system. To move through it now is not merely to follow water, it is to move across sovereign jurisdictions with their own laws, infrastructure, priorities, and political sensitivities. Even where the river itself looks continuous, the human frame around it is not. Borders segment administration just as cataracts segment navigation. What used to be a chain of kingdoms and frontier zones is now a chain of states, ministries, checkpoints, projects, and negotiations. The modern language is more bureaucratic than the ancient one, but the underlying issue is the same. The Nile does not belong to one uncontested passage. It crosses too many political worlds for that. That does not mean the modern Nile is nothing but dispute and paperwork, though a little paperwork does seem to gather around any important river, the way reeds gather around slow water. It means that exploration, travel, and even scientific work happen inside arrangements that must be negotiated. Basin-wide cooperation exists because no single country contains the whole story. The Nile Basin Initiative itself was created to facilitate dialogue and joint management, precisely because the river's waters and environmental pressures cross borders that the river never asked for. The World Bank's Nile Basin work likewise treats the river as a transboundary environmental and management problem, not a local feature. That is a very modern way of saying something ancient people understood by experience. The Nile cannot be approached as though one ruler, one map, or one traveller gets the final word. Any serious movement through the basin eventually encounters overlapping claims. Hydrology becomes diplomacy. Navigation becomes administration. Curiosity becomes permission. And the old dream of simply going farther starts to sound almost innocent. Farther through whose territory? Under whose rules? With whose approval? Those questions now sit beside the older environmental ones and are not going away. This is one reason the Nile can seem paradoxical to outsiders. It is famous as a river of connection. It linked ancient Egypt to lands upstream. It carried trade, ideas, armies, crops, labour, and belief across enormous distance. But connection does not eliminate control. In fact, it often intensifies it. The more important a route becomes, the more someone wishes to regulate it. That was true when Egypt established settlements in Nubia as buffers and trade posts. It was true when Kush and later Nubian powers drew strength from Nile-centred wealth and movement. It was true when Senna rose near the confluence, and it remains true when basin countries coordinate, dispute or plan around shared water today. The Nile never stopped being a route, but it also never stopped being a sequence of strategic places. That is the hidden difference between admiring a river and depending on it. Admiration produces paintings. Dependence produces borders, forts, capitals, patrols, and meetings where several people in suits try to remain calm while discussing cubic meters of water. So when we ask why the Nile cannot be truly explored in the complete old-fashioned sense, part of the answer is that exploration assumes a kind of uninterrupted right of movement that the Nile has rarely offered. The river's natural obstacles already broke it into difficult sections. Human societies then built political meaning on top of those sections. Frontiers formed at cataracts. Settlements anchored crossings. Capitals rose near confluences. Trade routes turned stretches of water into managed assets. Later, international borders divided the basin among modern states that must coordinate because none can pretend the others do not exist. All of this means that the Nile is not one long invitation. It is a chain of entries into other people's worlds. You may pass, perhaps. You may study, perhaps. You may cooperate, negotiate, or receive permission. But the fantasy that one can simply drift along and discover the whole river ignores several thousand years of people living beside it and structuring passage on their own terms. And once that is clear, another layer of the problem comes into view, because even when the river allows you through and the authorities do not object, the Nile still has a habit of withholding things from easy sight. And that habit of withholding things from easy sight is one of the Nile's oldest talents. Not because the river is magical, and not because it is unknowable in some grand theatrical sense, but because the Nile has always been better at concealment than its fame would suggest. It is one of the most famous rivers on Earth, perhaps the most famous if one is in a certain historical mood, and fame gives people the false confidence that they must already understand the thing in question. We hear the Nile and think of recognition. A river everyone knows, a river already explained, a river so studied, mapped, photographed, painted and narrated that there could hardly be anything left for it to hide. But that is the trick. The Nile does not hide by staying unknown. It hides by being only partly visible, while encouraging us to mistake the visible part for the whole. And rivers can do that very well. They show you water and conceal systems. They show you a channel and conceal former channels. They show you one bank and conceal how often that bank has moved. They show you monuments in dry ground and conceal the water that once passed close enough to make those monuments sensible. They show you a broad floodplain and conceal how many older surfaces, buried paths, old harbours, forgotten crossings, abandoned branches and silt-covered settlements lie underneath. The Nile does not merely flow through history, it deposits over it, shifts away from it, and leaves evidence in layers. What it hides is often not remote. It is right there, just below the surface, or just outside the frame of the modern river we have decided to treat as permanent. That is one reason so many people find the Nile strangely difficult to grasp, even after looking directly at it. The visible river feels authoritative. You stand beside it and assume this is the river in its obvious form. And of course, it is a real form. But it may not be the form that mattered most in another century, or even another season. The Nile has a long record of changing its channels, silting up old routes, raising floodplains, and leaving behind traces that only make sense when one remembers that rivers are not fixed objects. Britannica notes that in ancient Egypt, the river's alluvial silt gradually raised the floodplain, while land was also reclaimed from marsh, increasing the area available for cultivation over time. That sounds almost gentle when phrased that way, but the implication is quite large. A river depositing silt year after year does not simply nourish fields, it changes ground levels, reshapes nearby landscapes, and buries earlier surfaces. What one generation builds beside a channel, a later generation may find at some depth or some distance from where the active water now runs. That means the Nile has always been busy editing its own evidence. Ancient harbours do not always remain obvious harbours. Settlements tied to old channels do not always remain legibly tied to water. Paths of navigation can become dry land, marsh or cultivated soil. This is not hypothetical. Geoarchaeological work in the Western Nile Delta has shown that the old Canopic branch, once a major trade route into Egypt, later silted up and became nearly invisible at the surface. A survey at Naucratis found that the Canopic channel had been deep and wide in the late period, then migrated away from the town, leaving a swampy backwater that later silted up and was built over. The branch itself eventually ceased to flow and today is largely invisible on the surface. That is an extraordinary fate for a major river artery. It was not merely reduced, it was hidden in plain sight by the ordinary, relentless work of sediment and channel change. And once you know that, the Nile starts to look less like one continuous visible object, and more like the surviving top line of a much larger document. Beneath it are erased lines, overwritten lines, and old passages that can still be recovered if one knows where to look. This is especially true in Egypt, where the modern image of the river encourages people to imagine that the ancient relationship between settlements and water was more or less the same as the one they see now. Very often, it was not. In 2024, researchers identified segments of a major extinct branch of the Nile, now called the Aramat Branch, running along the foot of the Western Desert Plateau where many pyramids were built. Their work suggested that numerous pyramid complexes, including their causeways and valley temples, were positioned beside this former branch, which is now gone from the living surface of the landscape. In simple terms, monuments that now appear stranded beside desert were once tied to a substantial waterway. The river that made them practical later withdrew and hid its own involvement. That is a very Nile-like move. To help shape one of the most famous landscapes in the world and then leave later observers staring at stone in dry ground, wondering how on earth all of this worked. The answer, increasingly, is that the river they are imagining is too narrow and too modern. Ancient Egypt was not built beside a single unchanging channel, behaving politely for millennia. It was built within a shifting riverine world, a world of active branches, floodplains, embankments, backwaters, harbours, and local water landscapes that no longer look the same. The Nile keeps hiding not only by moving, but by allowing later certainty to settle over the places where it once flowed. And the concealment is not limited to archaeology. The river also hides by scale and by vegetation. The Sud is the most dramatic example, and it is almost unfair in how thoroughly it defeats the human desire for a clean route. Britannica describes the Sud as an almost impenetrable barrier to navigation, slowed by luxuriant growths of papyrus, aquatic grasses and water hyacinth, while the Al Jabal loses more than half its water there through evaporation. That is not a river in the storybook sense. That is a river dissolving into wetland structure. It is still there, hydrologically speaking. Water is moving, spreading, being stored, lost, and redirected. But visibility and usability have split apart. The Nile in the Sud can be present without being straightforwardly legible from the ground as one coherent path. It hides inside its own swamp. That matters because people often assume that once a place is mapped, it has stopped concealing itself. But maps do not cancel concealment. They only describe one layer of it. A wetland can be outlined and still remain deeply resistant to human passage. A former branch can be reconstructed and still remain invisible to a visitor standing where it once ran. A buried floodplain can be cored, surveyed, and described scientifically while remaining visually ordinary to everyone passing above it. Much of the Nile's hiddenness works in exactly that way. It is not invisible because no one can detect it. It is invisible because detection and everyday perception are not the same thing. Knowledge has to be assembled against the grain of what the surface appears to show. This is also why the Nile has been such fertile ground for mistaken confidence. The lower river appears simple enough to encourage broad claims. The middle river appears linear enough to tempt travellers. The upper systems appear traceable enough to inspire source hunting. But at every stage, the river keeps some important part of itself elsewhere. The steady white Nile depends on distant rainfall and tributaries not visible from the Egyptian or northern Sudanese reaches. Britannica notes that the White Nile's water comes in roughly equal amounts from rainfall on the East African plateau and drainage from southwestern Ethiopia through the Sobat system. So even when the river seems calm and consistent, part of what sustains it is happening far away and on a different timetable. The Nile hides by separating cause from appearance. What you see at one point on the river is often the delayed consequence of weather and terrain somewhere else. The same is true in the Egyptian Nile Valley itself over longer stretches of time. A recent Nature geoscience study on the Nile near Luxor found that the floodplain environment changed dramatically during the dynastic period, and that the sedimentary record reflects hydroclimatic changes influenced by both upstream conditions and downstream controls such as sea level change. In other words, even when historians look backward at the river in relation to ancient civilization, The Nile does not offer one simple environmental background. It changed, its landscapes shifted. Its sediment storage and release were not only local but connected to larger basin processes. The river can therefore hide history not only by covering things over, but by altering the physical stage on which that history took place. That makes the Nile unusually slippery as an object of certainty. It is not just that things are buried, it is that context is buried too. A harbour may disappear, a branch may vanish, a floodplain may rise, a city that once looked river-facing may now seem oddly inland. An old route may only survive as a canal line, a soil pattern, a subsurface anomaly, or an academic paper that mildly ruins one's confidence in all previous assumptions. None of this means the Nile is uniquely deceptive among rivers. Large rivers do this sort of thing all the time, but the Nile's combination of fame, antiquity, and environmental dynamism makes the effect especially striking. We expected a monument. What we have, in many ways, is a moving archive. And moving archives are awkward things. They do not hold still while you read them. Even when there are surviving records, monuments, and texts, the physical river that made those things meaningful may no longer occupy the same position or behave in the same way. This is one reason why exploration, in the old-fashioned triumphant sense, was never going to be enough. You can travel a river and still miss the river that mattered before you arrived. You can map the current channels and still miss the dead ones. You can stand beside the water and still fail to notice how much of the Nile's work has happened beneath fields, beneath silt, beneath deltas, beneath reclaimed land, beneath swamp, and beneath later human rearrangement. The delta provides another good example of this hiddenness. Deltas look open when viewed from above, a fan of distributaries and cultivated ground spreading toward the sea. Yet they are among the most historically unstable parts of river systems. Branches shift, channels silt up, coastal margins change, and ports rise or decline according to patterns that may only become obvious in hindsight. The old Canopic branch was once one of the main routes into Egypt, and later faded almost completely from surface awareness. If one major trunk channel can suffer that kind of historical vanishing act, then the modern confidence that the Nile is simply there in the same form begins to look rather fragile. What survives on the surface is not necessarily what mattered most in every period. The same can be said of the river's relation to monuments. Pyramids are perhaps the clearest case because modern viewers are so accustomed to seeing them against dry edges that the landscape seems natural. Of course, the pyramids are beside desert. Of course, the Nile is over there. The arrangement appears fixed because we inherited it visually. But the identification of the Ahramat branch suggests that many pyramid complexes once sat near a substantial, now abandoned branch that would have made transport and access far more practical. Once again, the Nile hides not only objects but explanations. The stone remains. The water route disappears. Later generations keep the monument and lose the river logic that once supported it. One could say that modern science is steadily reversing some of this concealment, and that is true to a point. Remote sensing, geophysics, deep coring, sediment analysis, and geoarchaeology have all given scholars new ways to detect extinct branches, buried channels, old harbours, and changing floodplain environments. But notice what that progress implies. It implies that for a very long time, important parts of the Nile's physical past were not legible from ordinary sight alone. The river had hidden them successfully beneath accumulation and transformation. Even now, every new reconstruction tends to remind us how provisional the visible landscape is. We are not discovering a static truth that was waiting intact. We are piecing together a history of movement that the river itself kept rearranging. There is also a more immediate way in which the Nile hides. It hides by drawing the eye to what is dramatic and away from what is consequential. People notice the broad water, the temples, the boats, the cliffs, the green strip against desert. They notice the tourist Nile, the picture Nile, the literature Nile. What they often miss are the less photogenic but more determining facts. The river is governed by seasonal inputs from far away. The lower reaches depend on upland rains. The White Nile steadiness is partly the result of large swamps and lagoons regulating flow. The floodplain is a record of deposition and erosion rather than a fixed stage. Old branches die and vanish. Sediment both nourishes and buries. The root on the surface is only the current expression of a much longer and less visible process. In that sense, the Nile hides by making the obvious parts so attractive that we do not look hard enough for the rest. And perhaps that is why people have so often felt that the Nile was both known and not known at once. It never lacked observers. What it lacked, for long periods, was the kind of evidence needed to connect its visible present to its layered past and its distant causes. The river could be sailed without being fully understood. It could be worshipped without being traced. It could be mapped without revealing its abandoned branches. It could be admired without exposing what lay below the floodplain. It could even be measured while still withholding the longer story of how its own valley and channels had shifted over time. So when we say the Nile keeps hiding things, we do not mean it is merely secretive in the romantic sense. We mean it has physical ways of removing evidence from ordinary sight. It raises ground. It silts over channels. It leaves swamps in place of roots. It shifts away from old banks. It separates causes from effects across great distances. It conceals former waterways beneath farmland and former harbours beneath later surfaces. It allows one age to inherit the monuments of another, while losing the water geography that made those monuments practical. That is not mystery for its own sake. It is river behaviour on a civilizational scale. And of course, once human beings noticed how much of the Nile story was hidden by the river's own movement, they began trying to correct the river, to stabilise it, contain it, redirect it, and make it more legible on human terms. Which turns out to be its own kind of complication, because the moment we started forcing the Nile to behave more predictably, we did not solve the problem so much as create a new one. Once people realised how much of the Nile had been hidden by shifting channels, buried silt, vanished branches and landscapes that no longer matched the stories told about them, the next human instinct was perfectly predictable. If the river would not hold still long enough to be understood, then perhaps it could be made to hold still. Not forever, of course. Humans do not usually begin with forever. We begin with phrases like control, improvement, storage, regulation, protection, and efficient use. Those words sound sensible because often they are sensible. A river that floods unpredictably can ruin harvests. A river that drops too low can leave fields thirsty and cities anxious. A river that arrives in great pulses and then recedes may be magnificent in theory and deeply inconvenient in administration. So the Nile, after centuries of being measured, praised, feared and followed, entered another phase of its relationship with people. We stopped trying only to read the river. We started rewriting it. No single structure represents that change more clearly than the Aswan High Dam. Britannica describes it as a rock-filled dam across the Nile at Aswan, completed in 1970 and formally inaugurated in January 1971. It impounds Lake Nasser, a reservoir with a gross capacity of about 169 billion cubic metres, and it was built to do several things at once: control the annual flood, store water for later release, expand irrigation, improve navigation, and generate hydroelectric power. The dam's 12 turbines were designed to produce around 10 billion kilowatt-hours annually. In practical terms, Egypt had taken the most famous river rhythm in its history and placed a gate across it. For the first time, the annual Nile flood in Egypt was not simply awaited, it was managed. That change was not a small technical adjustment. It altered the basic experience of the river downstream. Before large modern regulation, the Nile in Egypt followed a seasonal pattern that shaped everything from farming to famine. Britannica's hydrology summary notes that the river historically began to rise at Aswan in July, continued through August and September, and then fell through November and December. During years of high or low flood, the consequences were severe. Crop failure, famine and disease could follow. The old basin irrigation system in Egypt depended on this cycle. Floodwater spread over fields, sat there for weeks, and then withdrew, leaving behind a thin deposit of fertile silt before the next crops were planted. The flood was not just scenery, it was the operating system. To put it another way, the Nile before full control was troublesome and generous at the same time. Its floods could be too high or too low, but they also carried the sediment that made intensive cultivation possible over long periods. Britannica notes that before the completion of the Aswan Dam, large quantities of silt washed down from the Ethiopian highlands were deposited by floodwaters in Egypt, maintaining the fertility of riverine lands over centuries despite heavy cultivation. The flood was a hazard, yes, but it was also the annual delivery system for one of Egypt's most valuable resources. That is part of the reason modern intervention on the Nile has always been a bargain rather than a simple victory. When you regulate the flood, you do not only remove danger, you also interrupt gifts. And there were real benefits, which should not be brushed aside just because the story also contains costs. Britannica states that the high dam made it possible to release floodwaters when needed, maximise their use on irrigated land, water hundreds of thousands of new hectares, improve navigation above and below Aswan, and support a reservoir fishery. The dam also helped Egypt buffer years of drought by storing water in Lake Nasser, instead of letting the river's abundance vanish unused into the sea during flood season. A river that had once imposed a harsh calendar could now be made to serve a year-round one. This mattered enormously for a state trying to support a large population on limited cultivated land. Regulation is rarely built because people dislike rivers. It is built because they rely on them too much to leave them alone. Yet the more completely the Nile was controlled, the more obvious it became that the river had never been only water. It had always been water plus silt, water plus timing, water plus floodplain renewal, water plus nutrient delivery, water plus downstream effects that no dam engineer could cancel without replacing them somehow. Britannica says much of the flood and its load of fertilizing silt is now impounded in reservoirs and canals, rather than deposited on farmlands by rising floodwaters. It adds that Egypt's annual application of about 1 million tonnes of artificial fertilizers is an inadequate substitute for the roughly 40 million tonnes of silt that had formerly been deposited each year by the Nile flood. That is a remarkable sentence because it reveals the scale of what was interrupted. The old Nile did not merely water Egypt, it rebuilt its soils a little, every season. The regulated Nile does not do that in the same way. This is where control becomes a little less triumphant and a little more expensive. Once the river's sediment is trapped upstream, fertility downstream must increasingly be purchased, managed, and corrected rather than annually renewed by the flood itself. FAO Materials on Egypt note that after the construction of the High Aswan Dam, the reduction in clay and silt changed the treatment of reclaimed sandy soils and pushed agriculture toward other methods and amendments. In plain terms, once Nile mud stops arriving for free, modern agriculture must work harder to replace what the river once brought on its own schedule. There is no great mystery in this. A system that depended for millennia on deposited sediment will behave differently when the sediment is held back. The surprise, if there is one, lies only in how quickly people sometimes forget that rivers carry more than water. The shift in irrigation also changed the land in ways that sound dull until one remembers how serious dull-sounding soil problems can be. Britannica notes that virtually all formerly basin-irrigated land in Upper Egypt was brought under perennial irrigation after the completion of the High Dam. That is a major transformation. Under perennial irrigation, water can be supplied at regular intervals throughout the year, rather than arriving mainly through the old flood cycle. The gain is obvious: more control, more cropping flexibility, less dependence on a single annual inundation. But the river's older habit of flushing, draining and depositing had also helped regulate the land in its own rough fashion. FAO Summaries and Britannica both note that perennial irrigation in Egypt has been associated with waterlogging and increase soil salinity in some areas. Once water is available more constantly, the ground itself must be managed more constantly too. Otherwise, the land that was supposed to become more productive can begin quietly to sour. There is a quiet irony in that. The old flood could be cruel, but it did not pretend to be tame. The regulated river is more obedient at the surface, yet it creates subtler problems that must be solved by drainage systems, fertilizer regimes, canal maintenance, and constant monitoring. A natural uncertainty has been exchanged for an administrative one. That may still be a bargain many governments would take, and understandably so, but it is not the same as turning the Nile into a simple machine. In fact, the more tightly the river is managed, the more management it seems to require. Even Lake Nasser, for all its immense storage value, loses large quantities of water to evaporation because it sits in a very hot and dry region. Britannica notes that when full, the reservoir can lose up to 10% of its volume annually to evaporation. The river can be stored then, but not without cost even before the water is used. The delta tells an even sharper version of the story. Before the high dam trapped much of the Nile sediment, the river still fed material outward toward the Mediterranean coast. After regulation, that delivery dropped dramatically. Britannica's geology entry on continental margins states that the Nile Delta is retreating rapidly because the Aswan High Dam has trapped much of the sediment normally fed to the delta front. A FAO review of coastal effects says that before 1964, the Nile's suspended load at Aswan exceeded 111 billion kilograms per year. But since the high dam became functional, the river has transported virtually no sediment to the sea. That is not a minor reduction. That is the near closure of an old conveyor belt. The lower river still reaches the coast, but it reaches it stripped of one of its historic powers, and coastlines notice when rivers stop feeding them. The same FAO coastal study reports that erosion on the Rosetta Branch coast accelerated sharply after dam regulation, with a retreat of more than 1.5 kilometres between 1945 and 1972, and especially rapid losses after the river became controlled in the late 1960s. It also cites severe erosion rates at the Rosetta and Damietta promontories in later aerial and satellite analyses. Britannica summarises the same larger point more simply. The delta is retreating rapidly because the sediment that once replenished it is being trapped upstream. So one of the world's most famous river systems, once celebrated for building land, now arrives at the sea carrying too little of the material that used to help defend that land. Control upstream becomes vulnerability downstream. The ecological effect spread beyond the shore itself. Britannica notes that many schools of fish in Egypt that had fed in flood season Nile waters were reduced or disappeared after the construction of the high dam, and that the diminution in the number of anchovies in the eastern Mediterranean has also been linked to the serious reduction in the outflow of waterborne nutrients due to the dam. The FAO Coastal Review makes the same argument in more technical language, describing a sharp reduction in nutrient delivery to coastal waters after the river became controlled, along with coastal impoverishment and major changes in shelf productivity. Rivers do not stop mattering when they reach the sea. They continue outward as chemistry, food supply, salinity patterns, and sediment transport change the river, and the coast begins to answer back. That said, even here the story refuses to be simple. The high dam harmed some riverine and coastal fish patterns while also creating Lake Nasser, which Britannica says developed into a commercial fishery where Nile perch and other species thrive. So the dam did not merely destroy one system and leave nothing behind. It replaced one arrangement with another. Migratory patterns were interrupted, nutrient pathways were altered, and coastal productivity changed, but a large reservoir fishery emerged upstream. This is often how big river engineering works. Losses and gains do not occur in the same places, affect the same people, or take the same forms. One community loses a flood rhythm and another gains a steadier water schedule. One fishery declines and another grows. One coastline erodes while an upstream reservoir becomes economically useful. The river is changed, but not in one direction for everyone at once. The human cost at the dam site itself was also substantial. Britannica notes that the creation of Lake Nasser required the relocation of the Abu Simbel temple complex and the displacement of about 90,000 Egyptian fellahin and Sudanese Nubian nomads. This detail matters because it prevents the dam from becoming too abstract in the mind. Regulation of the Nile was not achieved by sliding a lever on a panel. It was achieved by drowning a former landscape and moving people out of it. Ancient monuments had to be cut and relocated. Communities had to leave lands tied to older patterns of life along the river. When we say the Nile was changed, we do not mean only hydrology. We mean settlements, heritage, memory, and belonging were rearranged as well. A controlled river is often also a displaced river. And perhaps the most important thing to remember is that the high dam did not create the human-made Nile from nothing. It completed a much longer process. Britannica notes that perennial irrigation had already been expanding through barrages, canal remodelling, and earlier works before the high dam, and that the old Aswan Low Dam had been completed in 1902 and raised later. FAO Coastal Review likewise points out that modern alteration of the Nile's hydrological cycle had begun well before the high dam, with the Delta Barrage in the 19th century and the Lower Aswan Dam in the early 20th. So the river we already changed is not only the post-1970 Nile, it is the modern Nile more broadly, canalised, pumped, regulated, allocated, measured, and increasingly expected to behave like national infrastructure rather than seasonal force. The high dam is the clearest symbol, but it stands at the end of a longer habit of remaking the river to suit human schedules. That habit has given Egypt and the wider Nile system immense practical advantages. It has also made the river easier to misunderstand. Once the flood is regulated and the banks appear calmer, it is tempting to imagine the Nile has finally been mastered. But what really happened is more complicated. We replaced one kind of uncertainty with another. We stopped the old flood and had to buy fertiliser. We stabilised seasonal water supply and had to manage salinity and drainage. We stored water and lost some of it to evaporation. We protected the valley from destructive highs and starved the delta of sediment. We improved navigation and changed fisheries. We made the river more legible to the state and less like the river that built the old floodplain in the first place. The Nile did not become simple, it became engineered. Those are not the same thing, and that engineered Nile has its own limits. You can hold back floodwater, but you cannot entirely cancel the costs of holding it back. You can regularise downstream release, but you cannot make silt magically reappear on fields or at the delta front. You can create more dependable irrigation, but you cannot avoid the need to drain land, monitor salts, and maintain a huge hydraulic system indefinitely. You can make the river look more civilized from the perspective of a planner, but the deeper truth remains the same. The Nile is a system crossing climates, soils, coasts, wetlands, and societies. Change one part and other parts begin to answer in slower, less theatrical ways. That is why the river still resists the idea of full conquest. Even changed, it stays larger than the plan drawn for it. Which brings us to another uncomfortable part of the story, because once a river is this large, this engineered, and this hard to move through evenly, the challenge is no longer only what the Nile hides or how we have altered it. It is also what it costs physically and humanly to keep pushing farther into it at all. The farther one tries to go with the Nile, the less the problem looks like one grand mystery, and the more it looks like a bill that keeps arriving in different forms. First the bill is geography, then it is time, then it is food, transport, fuel, labour and permission. And somewhere in the middle of all that, when a person is already tired enough to begin resenting the inventor of distance, the bill becomes biological. The river is not only long, it passes through environments that ask a price for being entered. Some of those prices are obvious: heat, thirst, mud, rapids, and delay. Others are slower and less dramatic at first. Insects, parasites, standing water. Water that looks refreshing, till one remembers that rivers are not tea served in a clean cup. The old dream of pushing farther upriver has always carried this second truth with it. Even if the Nile allowed passage, the body might not. That is worth dwelling on, because famous exploration stories have a bad habit of making hardship look decorative. A bit of fever here, a difficult march there, some rather uncomfortable boots, and onward we go. But the Nile Basin is not difficult in the theatrical way that adventure books enjoy. It is difficult in the boring, exhausting, cumulative way that ruins schedules and weakens people before they have anything grand to say about it. The Nile is about 4,132 miles, or 6,650 kilometres, long, and its basin covers roughly 3.35 million square kilometres across a large set of countries and very different environments. That means going farther is never a small extension of the same journey. It is often entry into another climate, another disease environment, another transport problem, and another administrative world altogether. A river that long does not merely continue. It keeps changing the conditions under which continuation is possible. Distance on the Nile is especially deceptive because the river's shape promises continuity, while its actual reaches keep breaking that continuity apart. The lower Nile looks like a broad civilizational corridor. Farther south, cataracts and rapids interrupt navigation. Britannica notes that ancient Greeks like Herodotus reached only the first cataract, that a Roman expedition under Nero was checked by the Sud, and that 19th century expeditions beyond the present area of Juba found rapids making navigation very difficult. Those are not isolated inconveniences, they show a consistent pattern. The Nile lets people imagine one long path and then insist that the path be taken in pieces. Every interruption adds time, labour and exposure. Stop long enough in a difficult environment and the river no longer needs to defeat you dramatically. It can simply wear you down. And then there is the Sud, which may be the best example in the entire Nile system of how distance and disease become partners. Britannica describes the Sud as an almost impenetrable barrier to navigation, and notes that the Al Jabal loses more than half its water there through evaporation. That means anyone trying to move through this region is not merely dealing with a river, they are dealing with a huge wetland in which channels spread, vegetation thickens, progress slows, and certainty drains away. Slowness matters medically as well as logistically. A hard journey can sometimes be survived if it is brief. A hard journey that stalls in wet heat among insects and unsafe water is another matter. The Sud turns movement into exposure. It is the kind of place where every extra day is not just another day. It is another round of bites, another chance of contaminated contact, another ration consumed, another body growing weaker under conditions that do not forgive much. This is where disease stops being a side note and becomes part of the river's practical geography. Around the Nile, and especially around irrigation works, canals, wetlands and slow fresh water, some diseases are not random misfortunes. They are built into the relationship between people and water. Schistosomiasis, also called bilharzia, is one of the clearest examples. The CDC states that it is caused by parasitic worms, that more than 200 million people worldwide are infected, and that infection occurs when skin comes into contact with unsafe fresh water containing the parasite's infectious form, which emerges from certain freshwater snails. The Nile Basin has long provided exactly the sort of freshwater environments in which this problem becomes persistent rather than occasional. So the river that invites washing, wading, irrigation, crossing, and daily dependence also carries a quiet medical threat in the same ordinary water people must use. That is the kind of difficulty exploration stories rarely know what to do with, because there is nothing heroic about a parasite. It does not care how historically important the river is. The Egyptian case shows how closely this disease burden became tied to settlement and water management. A WHO regional seminar states that schistosomiasis became endemic in Egypt as villages settled along the Nile Valley, that abundant water for irrigation and domestic use aggravated the situation, and that expansion of irrigation and drainage schemes, especially the shift from basin to perennial irrigation, created further danger for spreading the disease. The same WHO material describes schistosomiasis as the most prevalent and serious endemic disease in Egypt, while older WHO imagery on the Nile says the river's waters bring fertility to Sudan and Egypt, but also harbour the dangerous water snail that carries the parasite, with even more snails in irrigation canals than in the Nile itself. That is such a perfectly Nile-like contradiction that one almost has to admire it. The same water system that made life concentrated and productive also made repeated infection easier. In other words, getting closer to the river often meant getting closer to the problem. Malaria belongs in this picture as well, though in a different way. WHO material on malaria explains that the environment is a key determinant of spread, that local conditions such as wetlands and drainage patterns influence mosquito abundance, that dams and irrigation schemes can create opportunities for mosquitoes to breed, and that any clean standing water can serve as a breeding site. The same regional WHO seminar on Egypt lists malaria among the country's important endemic vector-borne diseases and notes that in the past it maintained high endemicity with epidemic outbreaks. This matters because the Nile is full of the kinds of managed and unmanaged waters that make vector control difficult. Floodplains, canals, irrigation networks, marshes, drainage works, and slow water near settlement. Even when a traveller is not deep in an equatorial wetland, the broader river environment can still be biologically unfriendly. A great river does not have to be tropical jungle all the way through to host an unpleasant number of mosquitoes. It only needs people, water, warmth, and enough standing or slow-flowing water to let them get started. Farther south and west in the upper basin and its surrounding regions, another disease enters the discussion with a much darker reputation. WHO's current treatment guidelines say that human African trypanosomiasis, or sleeping sickness, is endemic in sub-Saharan Africa, transmitted through the bite of an infected tsetse fly, and is almost invariably fatal unless treated. A South Sudan National Plan for Neglected Tropical Diseases states that WHO classified South Sudan as HAT epidemic, and it identifies Western Equatoria as the most endemic state, followed by Central Equatoria. That does not mean the whole Nile can be reduced to one disease belt. It does mean that in parts of the wider Upper Nile world, especially where exploration spilled into South Sudanese and equatorial regions, the health risks were not confined to waterborne parasites or mosquitoes. The farther one moved into the humid and river-fed landscapes of the upper basin, the more the biological cost of travel widened. The old heroic image of pressing on looks different when pressing on may mean entering country, where a fly can bring a disease that untreated nearly always kills. South Sudan's disease picture also shows why going farther is so often the wrong phrase for the Nile. It sounds linear, but the river's health risks are layered by region. The same South Sudan plan describes schistosomiasis as common in parts of the country, and notes endemicity in Unity, Upper Nile, Central Equatoria, Eastern Equatoria, and along the Lol River, while also listing sleeping sickness among the country's major neglected tropical diseases. So the upper basin is not one clean zone of danger. It is a patchwork of water-associated burdens. A traveller, trader, missionary, soldier, or surveyor entering such country did not meet a single obstacle to overcome once and then leave behind. They met an environment in which the route itself could become the medium of illness. Drink unwisely, wade carelessly, camp badly, stay too long, or get delayed in the wrong stretch, and the cost begins accumulating inside the body before the map has advanced very much at all. That is why logistics and disease cannot really be separated on the Nile. The longer the route, the more supplies must be carried. The more supplies that must be carried, the slower the movement. The slower the movement, the longer people remain exposed to local hazards. The more often a journey is interrupted by rapids, cataracts, marshes, or political delay, the more often camps must be made, water sourced, and bodies kept functioning in conditions that may be undermining them. Britannica's exploration history makes this pattern visible in miniature. Roman efforts stopped by the Sud, 19th century expeditions slowed by difficult navigation near Juba, and exploration continuing only gradually as traders, missionaries, and later surveyors established stations. Stations are what people build when a journey can no longer be treated as one clean push. They are admissions that the route is too long, too hard, or too unhealthy to be crossed in a single confident motion. And even when the disease is not fatal, it can still alter what exploration means. Chronic infection, recurrent fevers, intestinal illness, dehydration, and exhaustion do not need to produce dramatic collapse to end a journey's usefulness. They only need to make judgment worse, pace slower, and recovery uncertain. A person weakened by repeated exposure does not navigate rapids better. A crew short on strength does not haul boats more efficiently around cataracts. A caravan delayed by sickness does not become more welcome to the authorities, whose district it has been occupying for too long. The cost of the Nile is therefore not only measured in deaths, though there were certainly enough of those across the wider history of travel in tropical Africa. It is measured in attrition, in journeys shortened, surveys abandoned, plans reduced, and regions left only partly understood because continuing would have cost too much in health, money, or both. The river does not always stop people by force. Sometimes it simply makes further effort irrational. There is also the very plain fact that large river systems create dependence before they create understanding. If a place requires river access for food, transport, or irrigation, people must interact with the water whether or not the water is medically safe. That was true in Egypt, where WHO describes schistosomiasis as aggravated by abundant irrigation and domestic water use along the Nile Valley. It was true in delta and canal landscapes where snail habitats multiplied. It was true in marshy and riverine settings farther south, where water was not optional. This is one reason the Nile has always been so costly to know in a complete sense. Complete knowledge requires repeated contact. Repeated contact requires time spent in the river's environments. And time spent in the river's environments has often meant repeated contact with the very conditions that make people ill. A river can be central to civilization and still remain a health burden to those who rely on it most. Modern medicine, of course, changes some of this. So do vaccines, anti-malarials, treatment protocols, mapping, aircraft, better boats, and better supply chains. It would be silly to pretend a traveller today faces exactly the same bodily gamble as someone forcing a route 2 centuries ago. But modern capability does not erase the basic structure of the problem. The Nile still crosses immense distances. The Sud is still a major barrier. Schistosomiasis remains a freshwater risk where exposure occurs. Malaria still depends heavily on water and local ecology. Sleeping sickness remains a deadly disease in parts of sub-Saharan Africa unless treated. And the modern river has added bureaucratic and infrastructural layers to these older environmental ones rather than replacing them. Better tools reduce danger. They do not make the basin simple. So the real cost of going farther on the Nile has never been only mileage. It has been the combination of mileage with delay, delay with exposure, exposure with disease, and disease with the ordinary fragility of human plans. This is why can't we truly explore the Nile? Keeps yielding the same answer in different forms. Because the river is not only long, it is long through conditions that keep exacting payment. A journey south from Egypt is not simply a line extending. It is an entry into different climates, different waters, different vectors, different burdens, and different probabilities of interruption. Every gain in distance has traditionally risked a loss somewhere else. In health, in supplies, in time, in confidence, or in the willingness of companions to continue. The Nile never needed to hide all its answers to remain resistant. It only needed to make those answers expensive. And once that becomes clear, another shift happens in the question itself. It is no longer enough to ask whether one has seen more of the river, or travelled farther along it, or reached another important bend, source, cataract, marsh, or confluence. Because seeing more is not the same as understanding more. A person can survive the distance, avoid the insects, pass the border, cross the swamp, and still come away knowing only the visible surface of what the Nile is actually doing. That is where the next difficulty begins to take shape, because the river can be looked at, measured, and even crossed without ever being fully known, and that gap between seeing and knowing may be the most important one of all. That gap between seeing and knowing is where the Nile becomes especially difficult in a modern way. Because we live in an age that is very impressed with visibility. We have satellite imagery, topographic maps, hydrological data, aerial photography, historical survey sheets, remote sensing, sediment cores, geophysics, GIS layers, and enough animated river diagrams to make it seem almost impolite for a famous river to retain any ambiguity at all. We can look down on the Nile from space. We can trace its branches, estimate its basin, measure its discharge, identify its dams, compare old maps with new imagery, and watch broad patterns of change unfold over time. The line is visible, the floodplain is visible, the delta is visible. Large parts of the puzzle are more visible than at any earlier moment in human history. And still, to see the Nile is not to know it. In some ways, modern visibility has made that distinction sharper rather than smaller, because the clearer the image becomes, the easier it is to forget how much an image leaves out. A river is not only where the water appears to be at the moment you're looking. That may sound almost embarrassingly obvious, but it is remarkable how often people forget it. A river is also the pattern of where the water was, where it may go, what feeds it, what slows it, what vanishes from it, what it deposits, what it erodes, how its flow changes by season, how different branches matter differently, and how people living beside it have learned to deal with all of that. The Nile, more than most rivers, punishes any attempt to confuse visible form with full reality. Britannica's hydrology overview makes that plain enough. During April and May, when the main stream is at its lowest level, more than 80% of its water comes from the White Nile. During the flood season, the Blue Nile surge becomes dominant, historically providing most of the flood that reached Egypt. In other words, even when one is staring at the Nile in one place, one is looking at the delayed outcome of water histories unfolding far away in the East African plateau, the Sobat system, and the Ethiopian highlands. The visible river is only the final sentence. The causes were written elsewhere. This is why the Nile has always invited mistaken certainty. If you stand beside the lower river in Egypt, it looks complete. It looks like itself in a settled and authoritative way. One can understand why ancient states, later empires, and modern tourists all felt tempted to say, yes, here is the Nile, plainly before us. Yet Britannica's exploration history reminds us that even ancient Egyptians, who knew the lower and middle reaches better than any outsider of their time, were probably familiar with the river only as far as Khartoum, and with the Blue Nile as far as Lake Tana, while the source of the White Nile remained unknown to them. That is not because they were foolish, and it is not because the river was invisible. It is because seeing one section of a river, even a very important section, does not automatically grant understanding of the whole system that produces it. The Nile can be deeply familiar in one reach and deeply uncertain in another at the same time. The same problem appears when people speak about the Nile as though it were one uninterrupted thing with one stable identity. In practice, the river changes character so often that knowing one section well may prepare you poorly for the next. The White Nile between Malakal and Khartoum is, as Britannica describes it, a wide and shallow placid stream, frequently fringed with swamps. During flood season, the force of the Blue Nile can hold it back at Khartoum, turning it into a lake-like body of ponded water. The Victoria Nile, by contrast, is impeded by rapids and falls and is only navigable in limited stretches. The Nile, proper downstream, may then appear broad and stately again. To see the Nile in one mode is not to know it in another. A person who understands the regulated river near Aswan does not thereby understand the upper Victoria Nile around rapids and swampy estuaries. A person who knows the White Nile's steady contribution does not thereby understand the Blue Nile's fast flood pulse. The name stays the same, the river does not. And then there is the question of time, which is where visual certainty begins to collapse most quickly. What you see on the Nile today is not what someone would have seen 2 centuries ago, and certainly not what a boatman, priest, tax official, stonemason, or farmer would have seen 2,000 years ago. The modern river in Egypt has already been heavily changed by barrages, reservoirs, canal systems, and above all the Aswan High Dam. Britannica notes that the High Dam's complete control of the Nile's annual flooding means that much of the flood and its fertilizing silt is now trapped in reservoirs and canals rather than deposited on farmlands downstream. So even the river one sees now in Egypt is not simply the Nile in the old historical sense. It is the modern regulated Nile, a river already rewritten by human engineering. To look at it and imagine one has seen the same Nile that shaped the old floodplain is to mistake present form for historical continuity. The river in view is real, but it is not timeless. The archaeological Nile makes this even harder. One of the most striking lessons of recent research is that important parts of the ancient river are no longer visible at the surface in any ordinary way. The 2024 Communications, Earth and Environment study on the Aramat branch identified segments of a major extinct Nile branch running along the foothills of the Western Desert Plateau, close to many pyramid complexes. The study found that causeways from pyramids of the Old and Middle Kingdoms led toward this branch, and that geophysical surveys revealed a hidden river channel lying about 1 to 1.5 meters below the cultivated floodplain. In plain language, a substantial part of the river landscape that once mattered for transport, access and monument placement later shifted, silted up, vanished from casual sight, and had to be reconstructed with radar, geophysics, and soil evidence. Anyone simply looking at the present landscape would not have seen the ancient waterway that helped make those monuments practical. The Nile had to be inferred, not merely viewed. That is a perfect example of why seeing is such a poor substitute for knowing in this case. The monuments remained visible. The branch that once served them did not. For generations, people could admire pyramid fields and wonder how transport works so efficiently in terrain that now looks far drier and less connected than such building projects would seem to require. Then the buried branch begins to reappear through modern methods, and suddenly the landscape becomes more intelligible than it was when people were only looking at its surface. Which is rather humbling, really. We like to imagine that more direct sight brings us closer to truth. Sometimes it does. But sometimes ordinary sight is exactly what keeps the deeper structure hidden, because what matters lies below the fields, beneath later sediments, or along a former channel now replaced by a canal, or reduced to groundwater and faint traces. The Nile is particularly good at leaving behind landscapes that are legible only after the visible present is treated with suspicion. There is also the matter of scale, which turns even modern observation into a partial affair. Britannica gives the Nile a length of about 4,132 miles, or 6,650 kilometres, and a drainage basin of roughly 3.35 million square kilometres. That is not a river one sees in any humanly complete way. At best, a person sees sections. Satellite imagery sees more, but it sees differently. Hydrological models see patterns, but not lived experience. Local communities see the reaches that shape their own survival, sometimes with astonishing depth and practical accuracy. Archaeologists see old channels through cores and anomalies. Engineers see flow regulation and storage. Historians see changing political uses of the river over time. Each of these is a real form of knowledge, but none simply replaces the others. The Nile resists being known because it has to be assembled from multiple kinds of evidence, each one incomplete on its own. A satellite may show the basin beautifully while knowing nothing about how a shallow reach behaves in a given season for a given boat with a given load. A local farmer may know water timing intimately while knowing nothing about the Kagera headstreams. A hydrologist may know the flood contribution at Khartoum while caring very little about a buried harbour near a pyramid field. The river exceeds every single viewpoint. Older exploration history proves the point in a wonderfully stubborn way. Britannica notes that detailed study of the upper gorges of the Blue Nile was not completed until the 1960s. Think about that for a moment. This is not some unnamed stream in a forgotten corner of a blank map in an old imperial fantasy. This is the Nile, one of the most famous rivers on Earth, and yet significant study of one of its more difficult upper sections was only completed in living modern memory. The problem was not that people had failed to look. It was that looking, even repeatedly, had not yet produced full enough understanding. Terrain, access, scale, method, and the very structure of the river all kept delaying completion. The Nile remained famous long before it became fully studied in any meaningful technical sense, and it remains more studied than fully exhausted even now. Another difficulty is that knowledge of the Nile is always being sorted into categories that do not automatically speak to one another. Hydrological knowledge asks where water comes from, when it arrives, how much is lost, and how different tributaries contribute over time. Historical knowledge asks how people used the river, named it, fought over it, and depended on it. Archaeological knowledge asks where former branches ran, what they connected, and how floodplains changed. Political knowledge asks how the river is allocated, dammed, regulated, and negotiated across modern states. Ecological knowledge asks what species depend on it, and how changes in flow alter fisheries, vegetation, and coasts. All of those are forms of knowing the Nile, but they are not the same. One can know the river well in one register and still misunderstand it in another. That is one reason public talk about the Nile so often becomes strangely thin. People think they are talking about one object when in fact they are discussing several different layers of the same river at once. And then there is the old problem of naming something and feeling after naming it that one has somehow settled it. Human beings adore this move. It is one of our most efficient shortcuts. Find the source, identify the branch, mark the cataract, trace the outlet. Very good. But the Nile has spent centuries demonstrating that classification is not comprehension. The White Nile may be the longer branch. The Blue Nile may historically have mattered more to the Egyptian flood. Lake Victoria may be the place where the Nile proper begins. The Kagera may be treated as the most distant headstream. All of that may be true at once, depending on which question is being asked. So even the most basic effort to know the Nile turns into a matter of deciding what kind of knowledge one means. The river is not resisting out of malice. It simply does not reduce neatly to one preferred human category. Modern tools help, certainly, and there is no point pretending otherwise. The Ahramat branch study itself used radar satellite data, ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic tomography, and soil coring to reconstruct a hidden branch beneath the present floodplain. That kind of work is remarkable. It lets us recover lost parts of the Nile's landscape that ordinary sight could not have restored. But it also makes a more uncomfortable point. The fact that such tools are needed is itself evidence that the visible Nile was never enough. We had to stop trusting only what the surface showed us. We had to combine old maps, modern remote sensing, geophysical profiles, and subsurface samples to see a river that was no longer available to the eye. In other words, the deeper our knowledge becomes, the less it resembles simple looking. It becomes interpretation, comparison, reconstruction, correction, patience, and sometimes the admission that the river we thought we understood was only the surviving fragment of a much larger system. There is a more personal version of this as well. A traveller on the Nile can have a real experience of it and still know almost nothing about what the experience means in larger terms. One can sit on a boat at dusk, watch the current, notice the palms and the fields, pass a village and feel that one has at last encountered the famous river itself. And in a sense, one has. That experience is not false, it is simply local. It tells you something about one reach, in one season, at one water level, under one set of political and engineering conditions, as seen from one vessel with one purpose. The river accepts that encounter, but it does not surrender itself through it. This is why travel writing about the Nile can sometimes sound both vivid and oddly shallow. The traveller often sees a great deal and understands only the layer available to passing attention. The Nile is visible enough to produce confidence, and complex enough to make that confidence unreliable. Perhaps that is the deepest reason seeing the Nile is not the same as knowing it. Seeing promises immediacy, knowing requires relation. To know the Nile, one must relate one place to another, one season to another, one branch to another, one historical period to another, one visible channel to a former one political border to an older frontier, one dammed reach to an older flood cycle, one local impression to a basin-scale process. That is a much slower activity than looking. It is less flattering too because it requires the observer to admit that the river does not reveal itself all at once, and perhaps never will. You do not stand before the Nile and receive the whole of it. You collect pieces and try not to become arrogant about whichever piece you happen to hold. So yes, the Nile can be seen. It has been seen for thousands of years. It has been charted, painted, worshipped, tested, dammed, photographed, and filmed from angles so numerous that one might think the matter had become almost excessive. But to know it in the deeper sense is another task entirely. It means understanding a river whose visible present is only one moment in a much longer history, whose water comes from multiple climatic worlds, whose branches do not all matter in the same way, whose ancient channels have partly vanished, whose modern form has already been heavily altered, and whose meaning changes depending on whether you approach it as a farmer, archaeologist, hydrologist, diplomat, engineer, fisherman, historian, or person trying simply to get across without trouble. The Nile is not hidden because it cannot be seen. It is hidden because so much of what it is depends on things the eye alone cannot hold together. And once that settles in, the final point starts to become unavoidable. The failure to truly explore the Nile is not just a failure of travel or mapping or endurance or even science. It is a failure of the old idea that a river can ever be finished by human attention, which is exactly where the next part needs to go. The Nile can be followed. That is the important thing to admit first, because sometimes people hear a title like this and assume the argument must be that the river is still untouched, unseen, or beyond human reach in some dramatic old-fashioned sense. It is not. People live along it, farm beside it, sail on it, study it, dam it, cross it, and negotiate over it every day. The basin stretches across a huge part of northeastern and eastern Africa, and the Nile Basin Initiative today brings together 10 basin countries, with Eritrea participating as an observer. The river has been measured, mapped, divided into branches, and described in more technical detail than at any earlier point in history. So the Nile is not hidden from humanity. It is not absent from knowledge. It is not waiting for one final explorer to arrive and solve it like a locked box. The reason we cannot truly explore it is more interesting than that. It is that the old idea of exploration does not fit the kind of river the Nile actually is. It fits a simpler river perhaps, a shorter one. A river with one beginning, one character, one climate, one political world, and one visible shape that remains more or less itself as you move along. The Nile, being extremely unhelpful to simple stories, has none of those qualities for very long. It can be followed in sections, in systems, in methods, and in disciplines, but fully explored, in the finished and triumphant sense, it slips away the moment one tries to define what fully would even mean. If fully explored means travelled from beginning to end, the Nile already objects by refusing to present one uncontested beginning. Britannica notes that the Nile has several sources rather than a single one, while the river proper begins where water leaves Lake Victoria, and the most distant headstream is often traced back through the Kagera system. At the same time, the Blue Nile contributes most of the historic floodwater at Khartoum. which means the branch most important to Egypt's old flood cycle is not the same thing as the longest headwater line. That one fact alone breaks the old explorer's dream quite neatly. A person setting out to find the source is already making a choice about what counts as a source. The named beginning, the farthest feeder, the branch with the greatest hydrological significance, the place most relevant to downstream civilization. Each answer can be defended. None cancels the others. So even before the river starts causing trouble on the ground, it causes trouble in the question. A river with more than one valid beginning is not a river that can be fully concluded by one ceremonial arrival. It is a river that begins in categories, in systems, in highland rains, in lakes, and in headstreams. One may reach one answer and still not have reached the others. That is not failure. It is simply the Nile behaving like a basin instead of a myth. If fully explored means physically traversed as one coherent route, the Nile objects again by changing its own shape too often. The White Nile, the Blue Nile, the cataract-broken Nile of Sudan, the regulated Nile of Egypt, the Great Lake-fed systems farther south, and the Sud wetland are not versions of one identical travel experience. They are different environments stitched together by the fact that the water remains related. Britannica's descriptions of the basin make this plain enough. The White Nile is broad and placid in places, the Blue Nile is seasonally forceful, the northern reaches are broken by cataracts, and the Sud forms an almost impenetrable barrier to navigation. That means continuity on a map is not continuity in practice. The line continues, but the conditions do not. A person can move through one stretch and then discover that the next stretch requires a different vessel, another season, a local guide, more time, an unloaded boat, a detour, or a complete surrender of previous assumptions. This is why the Nile has so often defeated simple route thinking. It looks singular at scale and sectional on the ground. It behaves less like one long corridor and more like a chain of linked problems. You can keep following the chain, certainly, but the river keeps changing the price of doing so. At some point, "I am still on the Nile" becomes a geographical statement rather than a practical one. If fully explored means seen with one's own eyes, the Nile remains just as difficult, because seeing is one of the least reliable kinds of knowledge when a river is this old and this changeable. Recent research on the Ahramat branch showed that a major now abandoned branch of the Nile once ran close to many pyramid complexes and is now buried beneath the floodplain. That should make anyone a little more cautious about what looking at the modern Nile is supposed to settle. The visible river is only the present arrangement. Older channels may be gone from the surface, former harbours may be silted over, landscapes that now look dry may once have been tied to active waterways. Even the river's current behaviour often depends on conditions far away from where you happen to be standing. The lower Nile can only be understood in relation to rains in Ethiopia, lake systems around Victoria, the Sobat drainage, wetlands in South Sudan, and modern regulation at Aswan. So a person can stand beside the Nile and genuinely see it, yet still be looking at the end result of processes unfolding elsewhere, and the surviving remnant of channels that used to exist nearby. The eye receives one reach at one moment. The river asks to be understood across regions and across time. That is a much harder thing. It is also why the Nile has stayed famous without ever becoming simple. If fully explored means historically understood, the trouble only deepens. Ancient Egyptians knew the river extraordinarily well in the reaches that shaped their lives, yet Britannica notes that the source of the White Nile remained unknown to them. Greek and Roman curiosity reached certain limits, and then stalled. Medieval and early modern travellers inherited reports that were often partial. 19th century expeditions made major advances, but also turned a lived river into a European geographical argument. Detailed study of difficult sections of the Blue Nile was not completed until the 20th century. None of that means people knew nothing. It means the Nile never offered one single moment at which knowledge became total, and stayed that way. Instead, each age knew different parts, asked different questions, and carried different blind spots. One civilization knew the flood but not the farthest headstream. Another traced the lake outlet but misunderstood the larger basin. Modern researchers can reconstruct buried branches that earlier visitors walked past without realizing what lay under their feet. Historical knowledge of the Nile has therefore grown by accumulation and correction, not by final victory. Every time a generation thought the river had at last been pinned down, another layer appeared, an extinct branch, a new sediment record, a fresh political dispute, a changed flow regime, a forgotten route. The Nile keeps receiving description without exhausting itself. That is not because people have been lazy. It is because the river has always been larger than the frame through which any one age viewed it. If fully explored means politically accessible, the Nile becomes even less cooperative. Rivers running through one state can be difficult enough. The Nile basin spans multiple sovereign countries with different priorities, infrastructures, histories, and concerns. Modern cooperation exists precisely because the river is shared, and because no single country can pretend the others do not matter. The Nile Basin Initiative was launched in 1999 as an all-inclusive transitional arrangement among basin states, which is a very diplomatic way of acknowledging that the river crosses many jurisdictions and that management must be negotiated. This is the modern form of a much older truth. The Nile has long flowed through kingdoms, frontier zones and controlled reaches where passage was never simply a natural matter. Cataracts invited choke points. Confluences invited capitals. Narrow fertile strips invited concentrated power. Today the words are different. We speak of riparian states, agreements, infrastructure and resource management. But the old problem remains. A river this important is never only water. It is authority, leverage, surveillance, necessity, and argument. So even in an age of maps and aviation, the Nile cannot be treated as one freely available route from one end to the other. It enters too many human worlds, and each world has its own terms. A river you must keep negotiating is not one that can be finished by motion alone. If fully explored means environmentally mastered, then the Aswan High Dam should have solved the matter, and clearly it has not. The dam gave Egypt major benefits: flood control, irrigation storage, improved navigation, hydroelectric generation, and a huge reservoir in Lake Nasser. But Britannica also notes that the dam trapped much of the fertilizing silt that historically reached Egyptian farmlands and contributed to the rapid retreat of the Nile Delta, because sediment that once fed the coast is now held back upstream. In other words, control did not end the river's complexity. It moved the complexity around. Flood uncertainty declined downstream, but fertilizer dependence increased. Sediment ceased renewing fields and coasts in the old way. Delta erosion became more serious. Fisheries changed. Reservoir evaporation became part of the system. The river looked more controlled on paper and less self-renewing on the ground. That is an important lesson. Changing the Nile is not the same as finishing the Nile. Engineering can regulate flow, but it cannot remove the fact that the river is a vast connected system with consequences extending from Ethiopian tributaries to Mediterranean shores. Every intervention solves one problem by rearranging others. A river that keeps answering human control with new trade-offs is not a river that has accepted being completely mastered. It is a river that has merely entered a new phase of negotiation. Even now, with all our tools, the Nile still has a practical way of resisting complete possession. You can gather satellite images, field measurements, historical records, geophysical surveys, climate data, and water allocation models, and you should, because all of those matter. But none of them eliminates the fact that the river system crosses deserts, marshes, seasonal zones, deltas, reservoirs, highlands, and densely lived agricultural corridors. None of them turns every part of the basin into one evenly knowable object. Satellite imagery can reveal shape. It cannot by itself deliver local meaning. Hydrology can quantify flow. It cannot by itself tell you how a former branch shaped a pyramid landscape, or how a village understood a changing bank. Archaeology can recover old channels. It cannot by itself settle present water politics. Local knowledge can describe one reach with remarkable depth. It cannot by itself explain the basin-scale behaviour of the whole. So the Nile remains one of those rare things that modernity has not simplified into a single format. It must still be assembled from disciplines, from scales, from local experience, from regional science, and from histories that do not all align neatly. A river that requires so many forms of knowledge at once will always exceed any one act of exploration. The problem is no longer a lack of information. It is that the information belongs to different kinds of understanding, and the river is too large to collapse them into one easy picture. That really is the point that keeps returning no matter which angle we approach it from. The Nile is followable, but it is not finishable. You can trace routes along it, but another valid route always branches away. You can identify a source, and another source definition appears. You can map the present river, and a former river emerges beneath the fields. You can regulate the flood, and the delta begins to retreat. You can cross one border, and another political reality takes over farther on. You can survive the distance, and still come home knowing mainly the surface of what you passed through. The old explorer's fantasy depended on a place eventually becoming complete through contact. The Nile has spent thousands of years demonstrating that contact is not completion. It lets people live with it, use it, praise it, exploit it, fear it, and study it. What it rarely allows is the final sentence. Now the Nile is done. Now the Nile is fully known. Now the river has nothing left outside our grasp. The river's answer to each of those claims has been wonderfully consistent. It changes shape, shifts category, reveals another layer, or reminds us that the part we understand best depends on another part we have barely considered. And perhaps that is why the Nile remains so compelling. Not because it is impossible to study, but because it still resists being reduced to a completed object. In a world where we often act as though enough data should make anything feel settled, the Nile remains inconveniently alive as a system. It keeps linking distant climates to downstream consequences. It keeps preserving history by burying it. It keeps exposing the limits of maps, of definitions, of engineering, and of confident narration. That is not a weakness in our understanding. It is a sign that some things are too large, too old, too inhabited, and too changeable to become tidy. The Nile belongs in that category. We can follow it. We can learn from it. We can know parts of it very deeply. But a river with several beginnings, shifting channels, broken routes, hidden branches, modern dams, transboundary politics, and layered histories is never going to become the sort of place one heroic journey wraps up for good. The honest ending is smaller than that and better. We have not failed to explore the Nile because we lacked courage. We have failed only if we expected the river to behave like something that could be finished. It cannot. It was never that kind of river. So when we say we cannot truly explore the Nile, what we really mean is that the Nile keeps outrunning the old meaning of exploration. It is too distributed to begin once, too segmented to travel as one clean route, too layered to be read from the surface, too altered to be understood only in its present form, and too politically shared to belong to one uninterrupted passage. It can be followed, yes, carefully, partly, repeatedly, with better maps than ever before and still with a certain amount of humility. And perhaps that is enough for tonight. Not the grand satisfaction of a mystery solved forever, but something quieter and more accurate. The Nile is there. Vast, divided, connected, altered, and still refusing to become simple. We can stand beside it, study it, travel stretches of it, reconstruct parts of its past, argue over its future, and remain even now just a little behind it. And maybe that is the most fitting way to leave such a river. Not as conquerors, not as owners, not even as people who have finally explained it, but as listeners who followed it as far as we could and understood that the water was always going farther.